Chapter 401. Lu Yiqing was startled, but he did not fly into a rage because of Ning Kei's words. Instead, his eyes showed that he had expected it. He calmly explained, "I have been sitting on the futon these days. Although I didn't mean to, it always affected the cleaning of the academy. So I tried to do it myself. But I am familiar with it, so I don't admire it." Ning Kei did not expect that the other party would not be angry. He was surprised and naturally became vigilant, but he did not show it in his expression or words. He smiled and said, "I'm more used to using a broom." Lu Yiqing smiled mockingly, thinking that they were going to start bickering again. It seemed that Ning Kei was indeed as rumored. He would never miss any opportunity to disturb his opponent's mood. However, just as he was about to reply, Ning Kei suddenly stopped smiling. He brushed the front of his academy uniform with his left hand and put his right hand in the air in front of him. He said calmly and attentively, "Please." His posture was very imposing, and the calm and focused expression on his face, coupled with the extremely concise word "please," immediately attracted a round of cheers from the crowd. The sudden change in the atmosphere made Lu Yiqing squint his eyes. According to the Cultivation World's description of Mr. 13 of the Academy, Ning Kei, he was a ruthless and decisive person, but he was used to talking nonsense and bickering like a child. The Judicial Department of the West Hill Divine Palace had once commented that all the nonsense, bickering, and childish impulsiveness were just Ning Kei's tricks to disturb his opponent's state of mind. Lu Yiqing thought that he had a deep understanding of Ning Kei's temperament. That was why when Ning Kei said those mocking words that were enough to make many people lose their minds and even vomit blood, he could stay calm. He was even prepared to talk to this person for a long time under the watchful eyes of the crowd. However, he did not expect that the other party would be so direct and simple today. Could it be that he really had some kind of fortuitous encounter after cultivating in seclusion in the cave for 3 months? Lu Yiqing glanced at Ning Kei warily and turned to walk to the center of the clean and dustless ground. As he stepped forward, his emotions gradually returned to the initial absolute calmness. Ning Kei also walked to the field and waited quietly. Everyone's gaze shifted from the academy's side door to the green brick floor as the two walked. When no one noticed her, Sang Sang walked out from the side door. Perhaps because of Tang Xiaotong's identity as a member of the Devil's Doctrine, Chen Pipi and her did not appear. Lu Yiqing raised his left hand. His slender, muddy palm held an ordinary-looking cyan steel sword. He raised his sword and looked at Ning Kei, saying emotionlessly, "I know your most powerful weapon is the arrow. I will still use the sword." Sang Sang stood under the green tree at the edge of the field and listened to his words. She untied the heavy luggage on her back and put the big black umbrella aside. She found the dark iron arrow box and was ready to give it to Ning Kei as soon as he spoke. Ning Kei did not speak. He looked at the ordinary cyan steel sword in Lu Yiqing's left hand and slowly raised his eyebrows. Because he recognized this sword. 2 years ago, when he came to Chang and from the city of Wei, he and Sang Sang rented a shop on Lin 47th Street and opened the old brush pen shop. At that time, the business of the old brush pen shop was not good, so he clearly remembered who the first customer of the old brush pen shop was. It was raining in Chang and that day. Under the eaves outside the old brush pen shop, a middle-aged man was sheltering from the rain. The man was dressed in a green robe, and his eyes were handsome and free. His smile could brighten up the gloomy rain. The middle-aged man was the owner of the shop and habitually wore a sword on his waist. The reason why Ning Kei could clearly remember the middle-aged man was not only because he was the first customer of the old brush pen shop. On another rainy day, the middle-aged man came to the old brush pen shop with an oil paper umbrella. At that time, Ning Kei squatted on the ground and ate noodles. The middle-aged man squatted beside him and said a few words to him. "I'm going to kill. I need someone by my side." Because of these 2 words, the 500 taels of silver note and darkie's entrustment, Ning Kei followed the middle-aged man into the rainy night and into the shabby Spring Breeze Pavilion Street that had not been renovated. Then they began to kill, side by side, until everyone was killed. They walked back to the old brush pen shop and ate a bowl of noodles with fried eggs. The middle-aged man had a very arrogant surname and a very gentle name. His surname was Chao, which was the Chao of the Tang dynasty. His name was Chao Xiaoshu. Ning Ke and Chao Xiaoshu did not meet many times. But he remembered Chao Xiaoshu and would never forget him for the rest of his life. He also recognized the seemingly ordinary cyan steel sword that Chao Xiaoshu carried. But that sword was held in the hands of Lu Yiqing, a powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom. This was not the Spring Breeze Pavilion. Ning Ke looked at the sword and said after a moment of silence, "I won't use arrows today. I'll use a knife." For some unknown reason, he did not ask Lu Yiqing about the origin of the sword. Also for some unknown reason, Lu Yiqing took the initiative to mention the sword. "You recognize this sword?" Ning Ke nodded and said, "This is the sword of old Chao of the Spring Breeze Pavilion." Lu Yiqing looked at him and said calmly, "Don't you want to know why this sword is in my hands?" Ning Ke thought for a moment and said honestly, "Yes." Lu Yiqing seemed to be satisfied with his answer and said, "Old Chao of the Spring Breeze Pavilion. What an interesting name. On that rainy spring night 2 years ago, I think the Spring Breeze Pavilion smelled like blood. You may have forgotten that you had killed a sword master from the South Jin Kingdom." Ning Ke silently recalled the scene on that rainy night. Even though Chao Xiaoshu and he had killed too many people that night, it was not easy to forget that powerful sword master from the South Jin Kingdom. He murmured, "So that person was a disciple of the sword Garrett of the South Jin Kingdom." Lu Yiqing said expressionlessly, "He was the core disciple of my eldest brother, but he died tragically under the joint attack of the two of you. There has to be an explanation for this. Chao Xiaoshu was defeated by me, so his sword is now in my hands. But you are still missing, so I waited for you at the gate of the academy for 3 months." Ning Ke's eyebrows had been slightly raised ever since he saw the sword. Even when he was answering honestly, his eyebrows did not fall. However, when he heard Lu Yiqing say that Chao Xiaoshu had been defeated by him, his eyebrows suddenly fell down. His expression was extremely calm, even a little chilly. Lu Yiqing said, "Do you want to know where Chao Xiaoshu is now?" Ning Ke's tone was still very honest. "Yes." Lu Yiqing looked at him and said coldly, "Then show me your true strength and fight with me. Regardless of the outcome of this battle, I will tell you what you want to know." Ning Ke suddenly laughed. After thinking for a moment, he turned around and walked towards Sang Sang, who was under the green tree by the side of the field. Lu Yiqing thought that he was going to retrieve the rumored terrifying iron bow and smiled proudly. Ning Ke walked to Sang Sang but did not move. He was not here to retrieve the primordial 13 arrows, but to retrieve something else that sixth brother had just prepared for him. Because at that moment, he was ready to kill this South Jin Kingdom swordsman called Lu Yiqing. But when he walked to Sang Sang, he suddenly changed his mind. Because sometimes being alive was more painful than being dead. So he walked past Sang Sang and returned to the field. Lu Yiqing looked at him, who was empty-handed, and frowned slightly. He said, "I want to see your true state. I said that I will not use arrows today. I will only use knives." Ning Ke stretched out his right hand and looked at him calmly. "Because you are not worthy." Lu Yiqing still did not get angry. He asked indifferently, "Then who is worthy?" "My iron bow has shot Prince Long Qing and the Tao addict. You are not as good as these two, so you are not worthy." After saying this, Ning Ke took a deep breath and tightened his grip. His right hand grasped the hilt of the knife behind him that was pointing diagonally at the sky. He slowly pulled out the black and long padao. His movement was very normal and casual, but it was firm and did not allow anyone to interrupt him. Just like that rainy night 2 years ago, when a middle-aged man in a green robe killed his enemy in front of him with his sword. He was defenseless in close combat and did not hesitate to give his life to Ning Quebec. Lu Yiqing clearly sensed the change in Ning Ke's aura. But his emotions did not change. His dirty and dusty clothes fluttered in the spring breeze. He was like a bright sword that had been washed by the spring water. His most respected brother had once told him that no matter what kind of enemy he faced, and no matter how the enemy changed, all he needed to do was to pull out the sword and stab into the enemy's body. So Lu Yiqing calmly pulled out the cyan steel sword from the sheath and stabbed straight at Ning Kei's body. It was straight like a stick, like a willow that was frozen in time and no longer swaying. There was no sword style, and no flying sword whistled through the air. This was the simplest sword. But it was the most powerful sword. The sword garret of South Jin Kingdom was different from other sword sects in the world. They did not cultivate the art of swordsmanship. The disciples of the sword garret would never use their psyche power to control the chi of heaven and earth, and then use it to control their natal swords. The disciples of the sword garret only trusted the hand that held the sword. Their most powerful swordsmanship was the sword in their hands. With the sword in their hands, they did not need to use the chi of heaven and earth to control it. They could directly gather the chi around the sword. This was the swordsmanship of the world's most powerful sage of sword, Liu Bai. With the sword in his hands, it was like a river. Invincible in front of him was invincible in 10,000 miles. The loneliness of the past years in the private school of his hometown, the cold looks he received after coming to the sword garret, the thoughts he gained after sitting in front of the academy for 3 months, the scornful looks of the Tangs, the angry but silent discussions, and the pride in the depths of his heart, all melted into this one sword. It was such a simple strike, but Lu Yiqing had poured all of his cultivation into it. The air in front of the blade suddenly collapsed and retreated in all directions, creating an absolute vacuum. The few green leaves that danced in the air could not even land on the clean green brick ground before they turned into powder. The chi of heaven and earth outside the side door of the academy shook violently and gathered into the sword in his hands. Then it seeped out from the blade, forming a wind and thunder that whistled. In an instant, Lu Yiqing had crossed the distance between the two of them. The tip of the sword carried the wind and thunder and directly hit Ning Kei's face. This is the 6th chapter. I'm crazy. Then, there's still the 7th chapter. I'll sleep after I finish it. I really don't know when I'll update. I'll try to finish it before 8:30. I have to continue writing after I wake up. Wipe my sweat. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 402. The wind and thunder at the tip of Lu Yiqing's sword shocked all the onlookers. People's exclamations were still brewing in their throats, and there was dead silence. How could such a simple sword contain such a powerful force? Including the cultivators, among the onlookers at the side door of the academy today, only Qing Lixue, the priest of the Revelation Department of the West Hill Divine Palace, could really understand this simple sword. He was the only one who had already noticed the horror of Lu Yiqing's sword when he just stabbed. He held the window with his right hand and remained silent. This simple sword was actually not simple. It had the fullest and even the most perfect willpower, with 100 days of waiting and forbearance, and finally had Liu Bai's sword style. Because it was simple, it was powerful. Everything in the world was like this, including Haotian's divine light. Qing Lixue held the window with one hand and felt the sharp sword style from the side door of the academy. He thought that if he was facing this simple sword, he would definitely not be able to take it. He could only retreat to a place where there was no place to retreat, and use the desperate situation to squeeze out the possibility of the impossible. Even if Prince Long Qing was still alive, facing such a simple and powerful sword style, facing the wind and thunder at the tip of the sword, he could only choose to temporarily avoid it and risk being injured to find the last chance of survival and killing. If it was the Tao addict in front of Lu Yiqing's sword, could she block it? Qing Lixue thought of the news from West Hill and silently added in his heart. Of course it was the Tao addict before she went to the wilderness. Then he denied his own thoughts in his heart. If it was the Tao addict before she went to the wilderness, she would definitely not block this simple sword, but would attack with a straight face. Before she was stabbed to death, the person holding the sword would die first. So she would not die. She could deal with Lu Yiqing's sword. The wind and thunder came, and there was a hidden sword style in it. Facing such a dangerous situation and such a powerful sword, Ning Ke chose to close his eyes. There was only one explanation for closing his eyes at such a moment. That was, he wanted to commit suicide. Ning Ke did not want to commit suicide, so he slashed forward while closing his eyes. He knew that with his current cultivation state, he would definitely not be able to take on this sword. So he did not even think of taking it, nor did he try to attack like Yi Hongyu. Instead, he attacked back. The way he swung his blade was very simple. It was even simpler and more primitive than Lu Yiqing's sword thrust. This was because the saber itself was simpler and more primitive than the sword. Swords were deliberately forged by humans to be used as weapons of salute or slaughter. The sword could stab people, but it couldn't stab anything else. The saber was a stone saber that humans picked up from the heavens and the earth. It was first used for hunting. A saber could be used to chop people, but it could also be used to chop many things, such as firewood. Ning Ke felt the heavy weight from the hilt and the subtle reverberation of the blade cutting through the air. A sense of firmness and reliability that he had not felt for a long time returned to his body. He had not chopped firewood for a long time, and he missed it very much. Today, he was chopping wood again. Although his eyes were closed, his movements were still as skillful as ever. It was so skillful that it felt natural. It was so natural that it made people feel comfortable. Only Lu Yiqing, who was facing the blade, felt very uncomfortable and even uncomfortable. Ning Ke's movement was natural as he slashed forward. With a flick of his wrist, the majestic great spirit in his body flowed along the hilt and madly into the blade. Even if it was a treasured saber from the imperial palace, it would instantly disintegrate into countless metal fragments after being injected with so much great spirit. However, this new blade, which had been tempered by sixth brother and had the weight of 3 Biyaos, was able to withstand the pressure. The slender blade began to tremble at a terrifying speed that could not be seen by the naked eye, as if it would break at any time, or as if it would endure everything in silence forever. A buzzing sound. Previously, when Lu Yiqing had revealed his state, the black brick floor seemed to be spotless. However, at this time, the finest ash in the cracks of the black bricks was shaken out by Ning Ke's saber momentum and scattered in all directions. The people of Cheng and who were watching the battle could not see what was happening at all. The scene in their eyes was still at the moment when Lu Yiqing's wind and thunder sword was about to pierce Ning Ke's face, and the saber in Ning Ke's hand was just an ordinary saber in the air. Only cultivators with a high state could clearly feel that there was a majestic aura of heaven and earth dancing around the Biyao in Ning Ke's hand. The amount and purity of this aura of heaven and earth was even more terrifying than the qi of heaven and earth absorbed by Lu Yiqing's wind and thunder sword. Qing Lixue also held onto the window with his right hand. His body was tense and his face was full of shock. He Mingqi, who was standing by the carriage, suddenly looked up and held the wheel with his right hand. The green leaves in the air that were crushed into powder by Lu Yiqing's sword style turned into nothingness when they touched the saber wind. A wildflower that was peeking out from the crack of the stone steps in the distance disappeared in an instant. Ning Ke's saber and Lu Yiqing's sword finally met. The saber momentum was so majestic that it suppressed the wind and thunder on the tip of Lu Yiqing's sword. It trembled uncontrollably, as if it was a candle in the wind that could be extinguished at any time. Lu Yiqing was shocked. He did not expect that Ning Ke, who was the weakest person on the second floor of the academy and was even labeled as the shame of the academy by the Tao addict, could display such a powerful cultivation at this time. But he did not intend to retreat or stop his sword momentum. The sword in his hand was still moving forward. That was because he had been meditating at the side door of the academy for 3 months. He was fully prepared for what might happen in this duel, including Ning Ke's sudden increase in state after his hard cultivation. He firmly believed that when Ning Ke's saber and his sword met, there would definitely be a slight delay. Because as long as one was human, he would definitely think. As long as he thought, Ning Ke would think of Cao Xiaoshu from the sword in his hand. Why was Cao Xiaoshu's sword in his hand? Did Cao Xiaoshu really lose to him? Was Cao Xiaoshu alive or dead? If Cao Xiaoshu was alive, would Ning Ke still be able to cut him down with his saber? Weren't you worried that Cao Xiaoshu would die with me after this cut? Did you think you could stop thinking by closing your eyes and not looking at the sword? Lu Yiqing thought coldly. He firmly believed that Ning Ke could think. Even if Ning Ke had an inhuman willpower and could ensure that there was no delay in the movement of the saber, there would definitely be a gap in his state of mind. When strong people fought, they fought for victory and defeat were often decided by a single thought. Lu Yiqing knew that he could seize the gap in Ning Ke's state of mind, and he had been preparing for this for a long time. However, Ning Ke's movement did not stop at all. He closed his eyes and chopped down in front of him with his saber. The chopping was so decisive and ruthless. His thoughts did not stop either. The reason why he closed his eyes was not because he did not want to see Cao Xiaoshu's sword. He did not even think about whose sword it was. He did not even think that Cao Xiaoshu might be dead or imprisoned in the sword garret. If he chopped down with his saber, Cao Xiaoshu might really die. He did not think about anything. He just wanted to chop down the saber in his hand. This kind of thinking was very simple. Much simpler than Lu Yiqing's thinking. So much more powerful. The pedao in Ning Ke's hand suddenly became brighter. Countless golden rays of light shot out from the dark blade, like a sun leaping out of the sea of clouds, or like a burning cloud in the twilight. The golden rays shot out from the blade were gathered by Ning Ke's psyche power. They did not scatter around, but turned into a flame and hit Lu Yiqing's face directly. Qing Lishue's hands, which were holding the window frame, suddenly tightened and stood up in the carriage. With two cracking sounds, the window frame was smashed, and a big hole was made in the carriage. He Mingqi, who was standing beside the carriage, did not notice the movement behind him. His right hand, which was holding the wheel, was so nervous that his knuckles sank deep into the wheel, and sawdust flew everywhere. The two looked at the side door of the academy in shock and shouted in disbelief, "Divine skill!" A shrill scream came from the brick ground in front of the side door of the academy. Thousands of rays of light from Ning Ke's pedao hit Lu Yiqing's face like flowing fire. The pure Haotian's divine flame reflected in his eyes, and then pierced into his sense of perception, causing him a sharp pain. However, his eyes felt real pain, and all light disappeared in an instant. The world became dark. No matter how strong his sword heart was, he could not help but lose focus, and the momentum of his sword was disrupted. The pedao in Ning Ke's hand hit Lu Yiqing's sword. The momentum of the pedao was overwhelming. The wind and thunder on the tip of Lu Yiqing's sword suddenly disappeared like smoke. The burning pedao continued to cut down. The sword in Lu Yiqing's hand broke into countless pieces. The momentum of the pedao continued. Ning Ke closed his eyes and struck. He only knew Lu Yiqing's original position. Therefore, when the pedao fell, it did not hit Lu Yiqing's body, who was screaming and retreating, but hit the brick ground. But as long as it was cut down, it was enough. The burning pedao hit the ground heavily, and countless sparks flew. The Haotian's divine flame on the pedao suddenly exploded, turning into a terrifying aura of heaven and earth, and hit Lu Yiqing's body through the air. The wind was strong. In this extremely vast aura of heaven and earth, Lu Yiqing's body was like a sandbag in a hurricane, lightly flying up and landing heavily on the hard ground. He rolled a dozen times in a row in a sorry state, only stopping when he hit a peach tree at the foot of the hill. There was a cracking sound, and it was unknown whether it was the peach tree or his bones that broke. Lu Yiqing held the peach tree with his trembling right hand and stood up with difficulty. At this time, his clothes were torn, and his body was covered in blood, stained with dust. It was a terrible sight. The peach blossoms that had bloomed for some time fell like rain, sprinkling on his body. The color was even thicker than the color of blood. The most terrifying thing was that his eyes looked as good as before, and even had the cold sword style from the beginning. However, looking at his blank expression, he could not see anything. After a moment, Lu Yiqing finally woke up from his muddle-headed state. Only when he was awake did he begin to feel fear, and because of the extreme fear, he began to go crazy. He looked at the sky with his blank eyes, and held the remaining hilt of the sword tightly in his hand, as if holding the last life-saving straw. He kept waving it around crazily, and shouted hoarsely, "How can you use divine skill? Who taught you divine skill? I will go to sleep after settling the accounts." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 403. It was dead silent outside the academy's side door. There was no sound outside the brick ground or the carriages by the side of the road. Only Lu Yiqing's shrill cries reverberated in the air. The cultivators from various sects were shocked speechless. From their point of view, Ning Ke had no reason to win today's battle, especially after Lu Yiqing revealed his powerful state before the battle. They thought that even if Ning Ke cultivated in seclusion at the back of the mountain of the academy, he would not be a match for this young powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom. No one had expected that the battle would end so violently after it started so easily. The scene of Lu Yiqing flying out miserably happened right before their eyes. Could it be that this was the combination of talisman and martial arts that everyone had been talking about recently? Could it be that Ning Ke had really cultivated both talisman and martial arts in seclusion at the academy and had succeeded? The cultivators by the side of the road pondered in shock. The spectators outside the side door did not think much of it. They could not understand the battle between the two powerhouses. However, in the hearts of the ordinary Tangs, the students of the second floor of the academy were almost like gods. It was natural for them to defeat the swordsmen from the South Jin Kingdom. The reason why there was dead silence was because the battle had ended too quickly and people did not have time to be excited. When they were about to cheer, they saw Lu Yiqing's miserable state and heard his crazed cries. The Tangs worshipped the strong and sympathized with the weak. They did not like this person from the South Jin Kingdom who dared to challenge the academy. However, when they saw the previously powerful opponent become blind and miserable, they could not help but feel pity for him. They all remained silent. "How do you know the divine skill?" Lu Yiqing stood under the peach tree and looked at the sky with listless eyes. He held the sword hilt tightly in his hand and was finally more clear-headed than before. His face was filled with fear and great unwillingness. He suddenly became angry again. He held the sword hilt and stabbed everywhere like a madman. He shouted, "I can't accept this. Ning Ke, where are you? Come and fight with me again." Lu Yiqing was indeed very unwilling, especially after he found out that he was blind. His unwillingness became even stronger, directly turning his sadness and helplessness into anger. He was the younger brother of Lu Bai, the Sage of Sword. He was destined to be the leader of the new generation of disciples in the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom. Even the second brother of the academy believed that he had the potential to catch up to Lu Bai. From the first simple stroke, it could be seen that his cultivation in sword Taoism was extremely terrifying. In terms of strength and state, he was definitely not weaker than Ning Quebec. Even if he might be defeated in the battle because of a momentary slip, he should not be defeated so miserably and without the ability to fight back. Lu Yiqing used to think that the reason why Ning Ke could defeat Long Qing, Guan Hai, and kill Dao Shi was not because he was stronger than them, but because he was lucky and cunning. He had been preparing for this battle for 3 months. Whether Ning Ke used the horrible iron arrow or the divine talisman left by Master Yen Sei, he had already prepared a way to deal with it. However, he did not expect Ning Ke to use a knife. From the beginning to the end of the battle, he only used his saber. He only used one stroke. Lu Yiqing believed that if Ning Ke had not hidden Haotian's divine light in his saber, he would not have been unprepared and lost so miserably. Looking at the dark night in front of him and recalling the process of the previous battle, he was filled with grief and indignation. He thought that if they fought again, he would definitely win. Lu Yiqing leaned against the peach tree, his listless eyes falling somewhere. He held the remaining hilt of his sword tightly in his hand and shouted to the hillside in a trembling voice, "Come on. Let's fight again. Ning Ke looked at him quietly and suddenly said, "You have already lost. Why should I fight with you again?" Lu Yiqing heard his voice and quickly turned around. He looked over with his horrifying white eyes and almost fell down. He shouted, "Because you cheated, so I am not convinced." Ning Ke looked at him and said calmly, "How did I cheat?" Lu Yiqing's left hand trembled and stroked the rough trunk of the peach tree. He wanted to hold it tighter to make his body more stable. He said in a trembling voice, "This is the academy, and you..." Before he finished his words, Ning Ke interrupted him and asked, "The academy? Do you think I, a student of the second floor of the academy, have the geographical advantage? We are in the south of Chang'an, surrounded by tangs, so you have lost the harmony of the people. Or is it that today is the day I break out of seclusion, when my spirit is at its peak, so you have lost the timing?" Looking at the resentful expression on his face, Ning Ke sneered and said, "Don't forget that you have been waiting at the gate of the academy for 3 months. The whole world knows that you have been waiting for the day I break out of seclusion. So the location and the time of the battle are chosen by you. So why are you not convinced?" Lu Yiqing's body trembled slightly. The blood in his tattered coat mixed with dust and dripped to the ground. Ning Ke had never shown any mercy to his enemies. Although he had turned away from Sang Sang today and did not take out that thing, which meant that he had spared his opponent's life in advance, his original purpose was to make his opponent suffer more than death. So how could he not suffer a mental blow after the victory? So, if you want to be dissatisfied, you should not be dissatisfied with me, but with your stupid thinking ability. You shouldn't have blocked the gate of the academy and provoked our pride. You shouldn't have taken out Chao Xiaoshu's sword to provoke my killing intent." Hearing this, Lu Yiqing suddenly laughed crazily. Snot and tears flowed down his face. He pointed at Ning Ke with the sword hilt in his hand and shouted hoarsely, "I know you are cold-blooded and heartless, but I have underestimated how heartless you are. You clearly saw Chao Xiaoshu's sword in my hand, but you did not care about the safety of the person who once helped you. You did not even leave a gap in your mind. I have been practicing swordsmanship for many years, and I have a heart of steel. Today, I have met someone colder than me. I should not be convinced that I have been defeated by you." The proud young powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom finally admitted defeat for the first time after today's defeat. However, his words were still very bitter and full of despair and mockery. Ning Ke looked down at the dust on the bluestone bricks under his feet. He suddenly raised his head and looked at Lu Yiqing. He said, "First of all, Chao Xiaoshu and I are just acquaintances. We only talk about fried egg noodles and money. We don't talk about gratitude or hatred. Secondly, I don't know how his sword fell into your hands, but I know that an idiot like you can't possibly defeat him. What right do you have to use this sword to disturb my mind? What right do you have to be unconvinced? It's the toughest before the finish line of a marathon. I'm working hard. Let's start with 2000. The next chapter will be out before 1. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 404. Ning Ke walked towards the peach tree. Hearing the footsteps, Lu Yiqing became nervous. He held the hilt of his sword tighter and looked around in panic. He had said that he was unwilling to give up and wanted to fight again. However, when Ning Ke walked towards him, he realized that he was seriously injured and blind. He could not even defeat an ordinary person, let alone Ning Quebec. Ning Ke stopped in front of Lu Yiqing and looked at his bloody and dirty face. He said, "I know you are still unwilling to give up. Because you think that I hid my strength and was too cunning." Lu Yiqing's body trembled slightly. He pursed his lips tightly and used his strong willpower to stop himself from moaning in pain and falling unconscious because of his injuries. This young powerhouse from the South Jin Kingdom used his silence and posture to show that he was still unwilling to give up. Actually, that's because you don't know what a battle is. You thought your sword move was simple enough, but it wasn't simple at all. Because you thought about it for 3 whole months. You thought about how to deal with my arrows and talismans. You wanted to confuse me with words and xiao shu. Ning Ke looked at him and said, and I didn't use talismans or arrows. I didn't even use any skills. I didn't think about xiao shu or the sword in your hand. I didn't care about the relationship between you and the Sage of Sword. I didn't fear you, I didn't despise you, I didn't use words to test your will to fight, and I didn't use any tricks to confuse you. I just pulled out the knife from the sheath and slashed at you. Lu Yiqing understood a little and his body trembled more violently. Ning Ke looked at him and said, that's the real simple. After a moment of silence, Lu Yiqing said with a smile, I understand. Ning Ke said mercilessly, you don't understand at all. Simple thinking is the real simple. You thought too much. That's why you lost to me. And you said too much. Lu Yiqing leaned against the peach tree. His body shook and he almost fainted. Ning Ke didn't stop. He looked at him and continued, before the battle, you said that if I fought you with all my strength, you would tell me where xiao shu was. That was a stupid thing to say. At this point, he paused for a moment and looked at the blood-like peach blossoms under Lu Yiqing's body. He said, even if you don't tell me where xiao shu is, I will still beat you into a pile of dog shit. You threatened me just to make me more aware of the necessity of beating you into a pile of dog shit. Now that I have beaten you into a pile of dog shit, I'd like to see if you will tell me where xiao shu is. I'd like to see how you can still be unconvinced. Lu Yiqing finally understood why he had lost today. Although he was still unwilling, he had no choice but to admit defeat. However, as he listened to his opponent's incessant taunts, describing him as a pile of dog shit, and then thought of his heavy injuries and blind eyes, he immediately felt resentment. After a moment, the resentment turned into helplessness. As the appointed leader of the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom, he had lost to his opponent in front of the world. Moreover, he was blind and would never be able to recover his cultivation state. He might not even be able to hold a sword again. How could he avenge himself in the future? The pride in Lu Yiqing's heart gradually disappeared after this fiasco and Ning Ke's calm but ruthless post-battle analysis. He looked at the darkness in front of him and imagined the bleak future. His chest was filled with despair and his willpower suddenly collapsed. He leaned against the peach tree and sat down again. His right hand no longer had the strength to hold the sword hilt. Because Ning Ke's words destroyed the last straw. Ning Ke took a step forward and picked up the sword hilt. He looked at it silently for a long time. This was indeed xiao shu's sword. Of course, xiao shu would not lose to someone like Lu Yiqing. Then why did his sword end up in the Sword Garret of South Jin Kingdom? During the battle, Ning Ke did not think about anything else in order to keep his state of mind clear and firm, and in order to make his chop as simple as possible. Now that the battle was over, those inauspicious judgments instantly poured into his mind, making his hand that was holding the hilt of the sword tremble slightly. After the bloody battle in the Spring Breeze Pavilion, many people in the world thought that Ning Ke and xiao shu were close friends and very familiar with each other. That was why they could fight side by side while bathed in blood. However, Ning Ke knew that was not the case. The relationship between him and xiao shu was that of the landlord and the tenant. It was like the relationship between the leader of the underworld in Chang'an and a hired killer. Or as he had said to Lu Yiqing, it was the relationship between a customer and a customer. The two of them could be described as romantic, but they had never talked about it. Most of the time, they talked about money and fried egg noodles. That was why he and xiao shu were not that close. They had only met a few times, and he had never even been to xiao shu's home. However, there would always be one or two people in the world who came out of nowhere. They would casually walk into your life and say a few words to you. Then, the two of them would live and die together. It was like when xiao shu walked into the old brush pen shop on a rainy day. It was also like when Ning Ke and Zhu'er met in the village in the Yan territory. This kind of relationship was very faint, so faint that they might not have any contact for many years. Sometimes, they would occasionally exchange letters. Even if they met on a bustling night boat, they would just raise their cups of wine and talk about the matters after parting before parting again. This kind of relationship was very strong. It was so strong that when they met again after many years, they would look at each other on the street and smile. Then, they would take the knife that the other person handed to them and fight against the endless enemies. And when you knew that the other person was in danger somewhere in the world and needed your help, no matter if you were taking the imperial examination or marrying a princess, you would throw away the brush in your hand without hesitation. You would tear up the examination paper on the table, push away the officials in charge of the palace examination, rush out of the imperial city, take off your new festive clothes, ignore the beautiful and shy bride by your bed, and ride a horse thousands of miles away. Ning Ke looked at the sword hilt in his hand and remained silent. He did not know where Cao Xiaoshu was now and what kind of situation he was facing. He suddenly realized that the fact that he was not familiar with Cao Xiaoshu was a beautiful premise. Because of this, he did not know if Cao Xiaoshu was a person who believed that as long as the sword existed, he would die. Because of this, he did not have to confirm that Cao Xiaoshu was dead. Ning Ke raised his head and looked at Lu Yiqing, who was sitting under the peach tree like a dead person. He tightened his grip on his knife and took another step forward. He slowly and firmly raised his knife. The audience exclaimed. They did not expect that Ning Ke would kill this man from the South Jin Kingdom. In the crowd, Professor Huang He frowned and shook his head worriedly, indicating that he should not act recklessly. I can only gnaw on it for 22,000 yuan. This is the hardest bone. The next chapter will be out before 3:00. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 405. Ning Ke heard the exclamations of the crowd. As a Tang, he knew that it was not a glorious thing to kill an enemy after he had surrendered. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Professor Huang He's worried expression and shaking his head. He knew what the professor was worried about. If he killed Lu Yiqing under such circumstances, it would be equivalent to forming an unresolvable feud with the sword Garrett of South Jin Kingdom, especially with the world's most powerful sage of sword, Liu Bai. Ning Ke had never thought of killing Lu Yiqing, because he wanted the South Jin Kingdom to live a life worse than death. Now that Lu Yiqing was blind, he was satisfied with the result. But he looked at Lu Yiqing, who was sitting under the peach tree with a pale face. He slowly and firmly raised his padao, as if he was going to chop down at the next moment. That was because he was very clear on one thing. Even those who had fallen into a situation worse than death still didn't want to die. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such a situation in the world. The more determined and powerful a person was, the more they believed that they could escape from this predicament, and the more greedy they were for life. Lu Yiqing looked miserable and desperate. But there was no doubt that he was a man with a strong will, so he definitely did not want to die. Ning Ke wanted him to feel that he was going to die soon, so that he could achieve his goal. As expected, Lu Yiqing felt the cold knife style coming from above his head. He felt Ning Ke's undisguised killing intent. His body suddenly stiffened and he said hoarsely, "You want to kill me? As long as the sword lives, the man lives. If the sword dies, the man dies." Ning Ke said, "Cao Xiaoshu's sword is in your hands, so he must be dead. Since I have broken the sword, would I let you, who killed him, live?" Lu Yiqing felt fear. He struggled for a moment and said, "I did not kill Cao Xiaoshu." Ning Ke looked at him and said, "With your cultivation state, you could not hurt Cao Xiaoshu. But who knows if you used any dirty tricks?" Lu Yiqing smiled nervously and said, "Cao Xiaoshu has already entered the knowing destiny state. Do you think those dirty tricks can be used against him?" Ning Ke said, "But his sword is in your hands. Since we all agree that Cao Xiaoshu is strong enough, there seems to be only one possibility." Lu Yiqing seemed to have thought of something. He suddenly became nervous and did not want to say another word. Ning Ke said after a moment of silence, "Liu Bai did it himself?" Lu Yiqing did not answer his question. Ning Ke looked up at the peach branch with broken petals and suddenly said, "Tell me what happened at that time. Tell me Chao Xiaoshu's current situation, and I won't kill you." Lu Yiqing frowned and fell into an intense struggle. Right at this moment, a clamor suddenly arose from the nearby crowd, and the faint sound of an intense argument could be heard. Hearing the voice, Lu Yiqing was slightly refreshed and looked up. His eyes were blinded by Haotian's divine light and became even more terrifying because of his pride. He gritted his teeth and said coldly, "Do you still dare to challenge my brother?" Ning Ke looked at him and shook his head. He said, "Lu Bai belongs to my second brother, not me. Of course, if Lu Bai is beaten into a pile of dog shit by my second brother, I don't mind stepping on him." Hearing this, Lu Yiqing's face twisted in shock. In his entire life, he had never heard anyone dare to mention his elder brother in such a tone. His elder brother was the strongest person in the world, the Sword Saint Lu Bai. No matter if it was an enemy or a friend, when the Sword Saint Lu Bai was mentioned, they would involuntarily show some respect. Who dared to say that the Sword Saint Lu Bai would be beaten into a pile of dog shit by someone like Ning Ke? Some time had passed since the end of the battle. The onlookers saw Ning Ke walk to Lu Yiqing, but they could not hear what they were saying. They only saw Ning Ke's posture of wanting to kill Lu Yiqing, so they exclaimed. The Divine Hall's ambassadors and the sects by the side of the road were all silent. The South Jin Kingdom's ambassador and 2 disciples of the Sword Garret ran down the hill in a panic, wanting to stop this from happening. The Yulin royal guards had already pulled up a long rope to guard the side gate of the academy. Other than the 2 participants in the duel, no one was allowed to enter. Both sides immediately quarreled fiercely. The South Jin Kingdom's ambassador said angrily, "We admit defeat if we lose, but why won't you let us in to treat Master Lu? What are you Tangs trying to do?" The Tang Empire was the most powerful country, followed by the South Jin Kingdom. Therefore, the people of the South Jin Kingdom were used to seeing the Tangs as opponents. However, the Tangs did not even care about the South Jin Kingdom. The Yulin royal guards were the proudest group of people in Chang'an, and they even turned a blind eye to the ambassador's anger. The conversation about Chao Xiaoshu was between Ning Ke and Lu Yiqing, so they did not purposely raise their volume. Therefore, the onlookers of Chang'an and the students of the academy did not hear it. However, the cultivators in the horse carriages by the side of the road heard it clearly. Chao Xiaoshu's name used to only be famous in the underworld of Jianghu. However, after the battle at the Spring Breeze Pavilion, his name suddenly spread throughout the cultivation world. Only then did all the sects know that there was a hidden powerhouse in the Tang Empire, and that this powerhouse had entered the knowing destiny state not long after. Chao Xiaoshu had actually been killed or imprisoned by the Sword Garret of the South Jin Kingdom. The cultivators of the various sects knew the story of the Spring Breeze Pavilion, so they naturally thought that they understood Ning Ke's anger. They understood why he raised his knife and was ready to chop off Lu Yiqing's head. However, they did not think that it would be the right decision for Ning Ke to kill Lu Yiqing. What had happened to Chao Xiaoshu was only Lu Yiqing's own words. The Sword Garret of the South Jin Kingdom could completely deny it, because no one had any evidence. However, Lu Yiqing's blindness and severe injuries were witnessed by thousands of people. Under Haotian, no matter how tyrannical the Tangs were, they could not stop the South Jin Kingdom from treating Lu Yiqing's injuries and taking him away. However, it was obvious that Ning Ke was not going to let Lu Yiqing leave the academy alive. Ning Ke held his knife. Lu Yiqing lowered his head, as if he was waiting for death. However, he was actually listening to the movements outside. The South Jin Kingdom envoy roared angrily at the soldiers of the Yulin royal guards. The 2 disciples of the Sword Garret looked extremely angry, as if they were ready to pull out their swords from the sheaths at their waists. The atmosphere in the field became unusually tense because of the confrontation. At this moment, a voice came from the side door of the academy, which had been silent for a long time. The voice was calm and serious. It sounded gentle, but there was an unquestionable meaning in it. This person has been meditating outside the academy for 3 months. His willpower and perseverance are commendable. It is already impolite of us to not invite him into the academy. Today, he is seriously injured and blind. How can he withstand such a long journey? If we leave him to fend for himself, it would be against the harmony of heaven. It is not how we treat our guests. Youngest brother, why don't you bring him into the academy and treat him properly? Everyone was confused when they heard this. They wondered what this person was trying to say after saying so much correct nonsense. When they heard that this person wanted to bring Lu Yiqing into the academy, they could not help but burst into an uproar. There were many wonderful people in the academy. However, there was only one person who could use such a serious tone to say such correct nonsense. He was so unreasonable that he wanted to lock Lu Yiqing in the academy. Of course, it was second brother. Ning Ke smiled when he heard second brother's words and put his padao back into its sheath. Professor Huang he smiled bitterly and shook his head. He thought that this matter would become more and more troublesome. The duel that Lu Yiqing, the younger brother of the sword sage of South Jin Kingdom, and Mr. 13 of the academy, Ning Ke, had prepared for 3 months had ended. The onlookers gradually dispersed. Their faces were still filled with longing because they were only mortals and could not see the details of the battle between these cultivators. In their eyes, the battle had ended with Lu Yiqing stabbing and Ning Ke chopping. Not understanding did not mean that they would not talk about it. This was destined to be the most sensational duel in the world in recent times. It would definitely be retold by the people of Chang'an, and eventually become a more exciting and thrilling legend that was completely different from the real situation. In the days to come, there would definitely be many people discussing Ning Ke's simple and unparalleled slash in the wine shops and sects deep in the mountains. And it might even become a distant memory of the people in Chang'an. Dozens of horse carriages on the official road gradually left the academy. Only the horse carriage that belonged to the West Hill Divine Palace's diplomatic corps was still there, looking a little lonely. Qing Lixue did not leave. He walked out of the broken carriage and came to He Mingqi's side. He looked down at the side door of the academy, his brows full of confusion. The side door of the academy was tightly shut. There were some bloodstains on the green brick ground in front of the door. There were several short ridges formed by dust around it. They had previously proved Lu Yiqing's strength, but now they seemed a little ridiculous. Is it really possible to cultivate in talisman and martial arts at the same time? Qing Lixue frowned and looked in that direction, thinking hard. As the priest of the Revelation Department of the West Hill Divine Palace, he had a profound state of Taoism and was even more knowledgeable. However, he had never read about cultivating in talisman and martial arts at the same time in any ancient books. Of course, he had never heard of anyone successfully cultivating it. Even if you cultivated in seclusion in the cliff cave for 3 months and combined the two into one, why did you use my West Hill divine skill when you chopped at the end? Qing Lixue asked himself a question. This was the same question that Lu Yiqing had asked in a trembling voice when he was blinded and in a panic. How could Ning Ke know divine skill? Who taught him divine skill? He Mingqi, who was standing beside him in silence, seemed to have heard the voice deep in his heart. He said softly, Ning Ke is a student of the headmaster of the academy. Then everything is possible. According to the records of the West Hill Divine Palace and the descriptions of the divine priests on the Peach Mountain, the headmaster of the academy seemed to be an omnipotent person. Qing Lixue felt that this inference was valid, but vaguely felt that this matter was not so simple. He thought of the little girl he saw just now. The little girl standing under the shadow of the big green tree. Then he seemed to understand. Dawn is ahead, I will eat first. The next chapter will be out before 4:50. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 406. The West Hill Divine Skill was the most sacred and supreme Taoist magic of Haotian Taoism. It was even called the origin of Taoist magic. Different from the divine skill used by the deacons of the judicial department who patrolled the world, this divine skill was not a specific cultivation method, but a divine weapon given by Haotian to the cultivators. The disciples of Haotian Taoism who could practice the divine skills on Peach Mountain did not necessarily have the highest aptitude for comprehension, but they must have the purest Taoist heart and the strongest faith in Haotian. Yi Hongyu, the Tao addict, was able to cultivate the divine skills because she had done these two things. Prince Long Qing's faith in Haotian was firm enough, but he could not keep his Taoist heart clear because of the royal affairs of the Yan kingdom. So even he could not cultivate the real divine skills. For some reason, Qing Lixue could not cultivate divine arts either. Therefore, he could not understand why Ning Ke could do it. Until he remembered the little girl who had been standing quietly under the big tree. He recognized the little girl because she was the reason and purpose why the great divine priest of revelation led the West Hill diplomatic corps to Chang'an. So he thought he had guessed the truth. There was a courtyard deep in the wetland of the academy. Ning Ke and Chen Pipi stood on the bank of the wetland outside the courtyard. Perhaps it was because Tang Xiaotang was asked to practice by senior sister Yu Lian, Chen Pipi was silent. He lowered his head and stared blankly at the water plants in the wetland. After some time, he suddenly raised his head and said to Ning Ke, that divine light came from the blade. Ning Ke knew what he wanted to express. After a moment of silence, he said, "Special Taoism?" Chen Pipi shook his head and said, "The West Hill divine skill is not like this." Ning Ke frowned slightly and said, "I used a divine talisman to inject Haotian's divine flame into the blade. That's why the divine flame came out of the blade when I waved it. What do you think of this explanation?" "Nothing much." Chen Pipi reminded him seriously, "In the beginning, your blade was wrapped with the qi of heaven and earth. It's my first time. I don't have any experience." Ning Ke said sincerely, "There will be no such loopholes in the future." Chen Pipi mocked, "Do you really think you can deceive the world for a lifetime?" Ning Ke asked, "Even if they sense something wrong, who can find evidence for this?" Chen Pipi thought about it and shook his head. "Not really." Ning Ke relaxed and said, "That's good." Right at this moment, a shrill and miserable howl suddenly resounded in the courtyard, and then the howl came to an abrupt end. Silence ensued, and the two of them looked at each other before turning around and walking into the courtyard. In a secluded room in the courtyard, the old woman in the blue gown looked at Lu Yiqing, who was rolling on the bed in pain. She shook her head and put away the needles and other medical items in her hand, saying, "I can't do it anymore." Second brother nodded slightly and said, "Thank you." The door was pushed open, and Ning Ke and Chen Pipi walked in. Lu Yiqing gritted his teeth and endured the pain in his eyes. His left hand tightly gripped the wooden bar beside the bed and shouted, "What the hell do you want to do?" White bandages were wrapped around his injured eyes. Ning Ke looked at him and said, "You should be very clear." Hearing Ning Ke's voice, Lu Yiqing's face, which was not covered by the white bandages, revealed a vicious expression. He said in a slightly hoarse voice, "You blinded my eyes today, and I will definitely pay you back in the future." Ning Ke had always been a person who refused to be at a disadvantage, whether it was in a sword fight or a verbal battle. Hearing this person threatening him, he said, "If you really want to take revenge, why wait until the future? You can kill me now, because you know that I really want to kill you." Lu Yiqing did not expect that he would use words to express his killing intent. After a slight stiffening, he said in a cold voice, "My eldest brother is the Sage of Sword, Lu Bai. How dare you kill me?" Cultivators paid attention to their state of mind and willpower. Once they started to reveal their background, except for people like Ning Ke who did not care about manners, most people would feel desperate or even collapse. However, Lu Yiqing did have some hope and confidence. The Sage of Sword, Lu Bai, was indeed too famous. Although the academy would not be afraid of him, it seemed unnecessary to provoke the world's strongest powerhouse. At this time, second brother, who had been standing quietly, suddenly said, "Since you are Lu Bai's younger brother, the academy will not treat you harshly. Please rest assured." Lu Yiqing knew that the owner of this voice must have a high status in the academy. He might even be the rumored Mr. First or Mr. Second at the back of the mountain of the academy. He sincerely said, "Thank you for your care." "You're welcome." He was not being polite, but because second brother was an upright gentleman and did not want to lie. Moreover, he did not think that what he had done was worthy of being thanked. He said, "Because I plan to let you stay in the academy to recuperate." Lu Yiqing was stunned and asked with the last hope, "Then when are you willing to let me go?" Second brother thought for a moment and said honestly, "I will let you go when Lu Bai releases Cao Xiaoshu. If Cao Xiaoshu is dead, then you will never have to leave." Lu Yiqing heard the seriousness in second brother's words. The pain in his eyes and the fear of being imprisoned in the academy made him even more panicked. He said anxiously, "Cao Xiaoshu is really not in the sword garret. He is not dead. Eldest brother is in seclusion, so I could only take his sword and hurt him." Then he ran away. Ning Ke finally knew that Cao Xiaoshu had met the sage of sword, Lu Bai. Ning Ke finally knew that Cao Xiaoshu had indeed encountered the sage of sword, Lu Bai. Naturally, he was no match for him. No wonder his sword was taken away. But how serious was his injury? Second brother suddenly asked, "How can you prove it?" The room was silent. Lu Yiqing said, "Isn't it proof that Cao Xiaoshu is not in the sword garret?" Second brother said, "How can you prove that Cao Xiaoshu is not in the sword garret? How can you prove that he is still alive?" Lu Yiqing thought that no one knew where Cao Xiaoshu was. How could he prove it? The more he thought, the more anxious he became. He said, "How can the academy be so unreasonable?" Second brother said calmly, "A debt must be paid. A life must be paid for a life. A prisoner must be kept alive. You can only leave when Lu Bai can prove that Cao Xiaoshu is not with him and is still alive." The old woman in the blue coat said lightly, "I will write a letter to Lu Bai and ask." Second brother was slightly stunned and said, "Thank you." Walking out of the courtyard and to the wetland, Ning Ke could not suppress his curiosity. He wanted to ask second brother about the relationship between the old professor who liked to clean the academy and Lu Bai. Unexpectedly, second brother did not give him a chance to speak. He patted his shoulder with a smile and said, "Not bad." Second brother had always been a serious and courteous person. He paid particular attention to filial piety and fraternity. He treated his teacher as warm as spring, eldest brother as warm as summer, younger brothers and sisters as cold as autumn, and his enemies as cold as winter. He rarely smiled or praised people like Ning Ke and the others. Therefore, looking at the smile on senior brother's face, hearing the two words, "not bad," and feeling the strength from his shoulder, Ning Ke's legs gave way and he almost fell to the ground. He felt extremely comfortable. Chin Pippi pursed his lips enviously. Second brother turned around to look at Chin Pippi. The smile on his face had long disappeared. He said seriously, "Although you entered the academy earlier than youngest brother and have a higher cultivation state, you are not as good as him in some aspects. As the saying goes, there is an order to understand the Tao. When you get the Tao, you have to forget your identity as senior brother and learn from him." Chin Pippi thought, "When did you forget your identity as senior brother to learn from me? And what do I, a genius, need to learn from Ning Ke?" Although he thought so in his heart, he showed a respectful expression and repeatedly agreed. Ning Ke asked a little unconfidently, "Senior brother, what's good about me?" Second brother looked at him with satisfaction and said, "Finally, you told that person that one day, I will beat Lu Bai into a pile of dog shit. Such foresight and courage are very good." After a moment, Chin Pippi looked at second brother's back and said faintly, "I thought you wanted me to learn something. It turns out that you just like to flatter me." Ning Ke patted his shoulder and comforted him, "It's all knowledge, all knowledge." In Chang'an, the Southern Gate Temple in front of the imperial city was as quiet as usual. However, compared to the past, the quietness of the Southern Gate Temple was more tense and somber today. There was no one walking in the beautiful Taoist temple complex, but in the streets outside the Taoist temple, there were many experts from the Tang military and the Imperial Center administration hiding. Recently, the defense of the Southern Gate Temple was even tighter than that of the Imperial Palace. It was not the Imperial Court's fault for being nervous. It was because the bigwig who lived in the Southern Gate Temple was too respected. If anything happened to the bigwig in the Tang Empire, the whole world would probably fall into the flames of war. The great divine priest of revelation of the West Hill Divine Palace lived here. In the Taoist temple deep in the Southern Gate Temple, an old man in a gorgeous divine robe sat in the depths of the dark wooden floor. His closed eyes were surrounded by wrinkles like dry land. Qing Lishue, the priest of the Revelation Department, knelt respectfully in front of the old man. When junior brother Long Qing was destroyed by him, the Divine Hall thought that it was because of the terrifying divine item provided by the Academy. Even when Monk Guanhai and Dao Shi were defeated by him, no one thought that he was very strong. Qing Lishue organized the words in his heart. After a short pause, he continued respectfully, "Today, I watched his battle with Luiqing and confirmed that he should have entered the upper see-through state. Compared to when we met in the wilderness, his cultivation state is improving at a terrifying speed." The person who could make Qing Lishue so respectful was naturally the great divine priest of revelation. The great divine priest of revelation slowly opened his eyes. The deep wrinkles at the corners of his eyes gradually stretched out as he opened his eyes. It was like a dry land that was moistened by the spring rain for a night. The headmaster returned to the academy and can personally guide him. If his cultivation state still improves at the speed of an ordinary person, then it will be truly terrifying. The great divine priest of revelation looked at his disciple in front of him and asked, "But why is he able to cultivate the divine skill?" Qing Lishue said, "I am wondering if it has something to do with junior sister Sang Sang." The great divine priest of revelation looked at him quietly and said, "How can you prove it?" "Actually, I am in a very bad state today because of some things. But when I wrote this chapter, I was very happy. When second brother said how to prove it, there is still one more chapter. I will continue. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 407. Qing Lishue shook his head after a moment of hesitation. The great divine priest of revelation recalled what had happened many years ago and said indifferently, "Then do you know that Mr. Ku from the academy once showed his divine skills to the world?" Qing Lishue was shocked speechless. He was already confused that there was someone else who could cultivate the divine skill other than the West Hill Divine Palace. He could barely accept what had happened to Ning Ke because of Sang Sang. But now he heard from the great divine priest that someone in the academy had already mastered the divine skill many years ago. This was really unacceptable, even if that person was the legendary Mr. Ku. The great divine priest of revelation said, "Whether Ning Ke learned the West Hill divine skill from Sang Sang or found the key from Mr. Ku's legacy, it made no difference to Haotian Taoism. But Mr. Ku's faith in Haotian can't be so firm. How could he cultivate the divine skill? If Ning Ke learned the divine skill from Mr. Ku, what is it exactly?" Qing Lishue said blankly, "Even if Ning Ke is Uncle Yen Sei's disciple, we still have to be more vigilant. What is faith? This is a very complicated question in itself. As for what is called firmness, that is something that only the great Hao Tian can judge for himself." The great divine priest of revelation said indifferently, "Your question is not the responsibility of the Revelation Department. It is a question of the Judicial Department. Write a letter to the West Hill later and let them handle it themselves." Qing Lishue nodded and thought of the message from the West Hill a few days ago. He frowned slightly and said, "I heard that the great divine priest of judgment has not recovered from his injury. Recently, his mood." The great divine priest of revelation looked into his eyes and said, "The three departments of the divine hall each have their own responsibilities. You'd better stay away from the judicial department. Don't dirty yourself with that basin of dirty water." Qing Lishue heard this and asked in surprise, "I don't understand." The great divine priest of revelation looked at the dark floor in front of him, as if he was looking at the dark prison in the depths of Peach Mountain. He sighed and said, when the judicial department instructed Qingguan Taoism to publicize Lu Bai's name, they wanted to make the sword Garrett angry. Today's battle at the gate of the academy started because of this. Even the key points were planned by the judicial department. However, these people who are used to conspiracies and violence never understand that this is a matter between the academy and Lu Bai. It is wrong for the Divine Hall to intervene. The more they do, the more mistakes they will make. It was only then that Qing Lixue realized that the West Hill Divine Palace had done something behind the scenes. The great divine priest of revelation lowered his eyes slightly, and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes deepened. He said slowly, "Senior brother Guang is gone, and I am old. Seeing that something big is about to happen in the judicial department, I feel a little uneasy." Qing Lixue asked nervously, "Since we already knew that something big was going to happen, why can't we stop it in advance?" The great divine priest of revelation raised his head and looked at him lovingly. He said, "You have followed me for more than 20 years, and you have been in the revelation department for a long time. Don't you know that the so-called revelation is just an order from heaven? We may know some things in advance, but that is what Haotian wants us to know. Stop it in advance? Wouldn't that be against heaven? What's more, the event of the judicial department might not be a bad thing for the Divine Hall." The Jishou Abbey was an unknown place. Not many people knew of the existence of this dilapidated Taoist temple. Even those who knew of the existence of the Jishou Abbey did not know that this Taoist abbey, which was high up in the clouds of Haotian Taoism, was in a deep mountain not far from Peach Mountain, quietly looking at the magnificent and solemn Taoist temples. In the first thatched hut by the lake behind the Taoist temple. The lake breeze blew through the window again, opened the cover of the hand scroll of the tomes of arcane, and stopped on a certain page. The middle-aged Taoist by the table looked at the name on the page in silence. The middle-aged Taoist had been in charge of the tomes of arcane for many years, but he had never seen such a thing happen on the hand scroll. 3 months ago, the name disappeared. Yesterday, that name appeared again, but it did not appear in its original place. Instead, it was flipped by the lake wind. Sometimes it appeared on the previous page, and sometimes it appeared on the next page. It did not stop until it finally returned to the first page, but its position had changed. The name suddenly appeared on the top of the book from an inconspicuous corner, like a firework rising from the wilderness, and was about to touch the sky in an instant. From the lower see-through state, you are about to see the threshold of the knowing destiny state. The headmaster of the academy is really amazing. The middle-aged Taoist looked at the restless name and said with a smile, "I have been in charge of the tomes of arcane for many years. Your speed of improvement can be ranked in the top 5, but your elusiveness is definitely the first." Not far away, the name of Prince Long Qing was as faint as usual, but the last stroke of the word Qing seemed to be thicker than before, as if someone had added a stroke of ink. The middle-aged Taoist did not notice the change of Prince Long Qing's name. All his attention was on the restless name. Then, he looked up at the top of the tomes of arcane and nodded with satisfaction. The name Yi Hongyu was hanging there, as if it could break out of the paper at any time. It looked extremely aloof and arrogant, leaving all the other names on the page far behind. Between the cliffs of the Peach Mountain of West Hill that seemed to have been split by a divine axe, there was a Taoist temple made of countless huge black rocks. A green figure stood quietly at the stone steps in front of the temple, looking extremely small. After returning from the wilderness, it was unknown whether it was because she was tired of the blood-like red, or because she wanted to cover the 2 horrible wounds on her shoulders. Yi Hongyu was no longer wearing the beautiful bright red dress. Instead, she wore a loose green Taoist robe like the lowliest Taoist servant in the Divine Hall. The deacons of the judicial department of the Divine Hall looked at her in front of the temple with complicated expressions. There were despise, sadness, pity, mockery, disdain, and anger. Most of them were negative emotions. In the past, she was the Grand Master of the judicial department and above all others. She was the Tao addict who was praised by the entire Haotian Taoism. She was proud and indifferent. Although she handed over the specific affairs of the judicial department to Prince Longqing to handle, she would not show mercy when her subordinate deacons made a mistake. At that time, everyone in the judicial department was in awe of her because of her coldness and strength. But now, everyone knew that the Tao addict was no longer the Tao addict of the past. She was no longer powerful, so she was no longer cold. Therefore, no one was in awe of her anymore. They even deliberately looked at her with mockery because of some kind of emotion. For the Ming hand scroll of the Tomes of Arcane, the West Hill Divine Palace had invested a lot of manpower in the wilderness last year. The specific affairs were handled by the judicial department. In other words, it was Yi Hongyu who was in charge. The judicial department had planned for a long time, but in the end, they failed miserably. From the commander of the cavalrymen of the Divine Hall to the strange disappearance of the two black deacons, the destruction of Prince Longqing, and the failure to snatch the Tomes of Arcane, the judicial department, which used to be cold and powerful, actually seemed so weak. No one in the Divine Hall cared about the fight for the Ming hand scroll of the Tomes of Arcane. In the end, it had long been out of the scope of cultivation power in the world. It had evolved into a story among the world wayfarers of the academy and other unknown places. Now, Yi Hongyu was not qualified to participate in that level of battle. She should not participate in that level of battle. Everyone thought that since Yi Hongyu was the Grand Master of the Judicial Department, then the failure was her responsibility. The West Hill Divine Palace believed in the light of Haotian. However, the Taoism Hall was not necessarily completely bright, especially when the judicial department walked in the dark and worshipped power the most. Therefore, as long as Yi Hongyu was still the powerful Tao addict of the West Hill Divine Palace, then these things would not affect her at all. The problem was that Yi Hongyu herself had a problem. During the trip to the wilderness, she met the terrifying Master Lotus at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. He used the practice of Tao Tai to devour her flesh and blood. At the moment of life and death, she used the secret method of Haotian Taoism to forcefully lower her state in exchange for a moment of powerful brilliance. Finally, she joined hands with Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan to walk back from the brink of death. However, she had just entered the knowing destiny state in the snow cliff. Before her state had stabilized, she forcefully lowered her state again, which caused an even more terrifying counterattack. Since leaving the wilderness, her state had been constantly falling, and she could not even stay at the upper see-through state. According to the current trend, she might fall to the lower see-through state or even lower levels before her cultivation could finally stabilize. What was more terrifying was that she might not have any hope of returning to the knowing destiny state in this lifetime. If the Tao addict was no longer powerful, would she still be the Tao addict? The people of the judicial department, who respected power, naturally did not respect her as they used to. However, Yi Hongyu became more and more silent and calm in the face of the changes in her body. She moved into a quiet and remote stone house, as if she wanted to send a message to everyone by doing so. However, the more she did so, the more people felt that she was no longer qualified to be respected. The people in the West Hill Divine Palace looked at her with more and more complicated expressions. The ridicule in many people's eyes became more and more obvious. There was even a saying in the judicial department. Prince Longqing was dead, and so was the Tao addict. The girl in green standing in front of the hall was just a good-for-nothing named Yi Hongyu. A deacon walked out of the judicial temple and gently invited her in. Yi Hongyu nodded slightly and then calmly walked into the Black Taoist temple. The interior of the Black Taoist temple was spacious, and there was a curtain woven from pearls and jade in the deepest part. Yi Hongyu walked very slowly, and it took her a long time to reach the curtain. Behind the curtain was the divine throne carved from a whole piece of South Sea ink jade. The color of the jade was like solidified blood. The great divine priest of judgment sat on the divine throne with her hand on her forehead. She seemed to be resting and did not speak. Yi Hongyu stood quietly outside the curtain and did not speak either. There was not even a trace of wind in the spacious Taoist temple. The silence continued. She understood something. Then, she slowly lifted the front of her green Taoist robe and knelt in front of the great divine priest of judgment. Everyone in the judicial department had to kneel before the great divine priest of judgment to show their obedience and respect. In the past, only the Tao addict could not kneel because she was proud and powerful. But she was not the Tao addict now, so she had to kneel, and she had to kneel more respectfully than others. Blowing kisses, blowing kisses. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 408. I recommend a new book, The Spear Breaks the World, book number 2346448. The author, Yang Zhelang, once participated in the book review contest of The Coming Night. He wrote The Coming Night finale and won the second prize. Please support him. The great divine priest of judgment, who was sitting on the black jade throne, slowly opened his eyes and looked at the girl kneeling outside the curtain. His face was expressionless, but his eyes seemed to hide many complicated emotions. After a long time, the great divine priest of judgment said coldly, "Although you have become a useless person now, I hope you still have your vision." The voice was slightly hoarse, calm and elegant, but there was a hint of violence that could not be hidden. It directly shook the bead curtain in front of the throne. The clear sound echoed in the empty Taoist hall, like a rainstorm falling into an empty porcelain bowl. Yi Hongyu quietly knelt in front of the curtain. She was not moved by the noise and the power contained in the voice. She just lowered her head and appeared more respectful. A deacon from the judicial department came out from behind the curtain with a file in his hands. He walked to her, smiled gently and comforted her, and then handed the file to her. Yi Hongyu took the scroll quietly. She did not get up and continued to kneel. She carefully read the contents of the scroll and then fell into a long period of thought. The file was sent back to the West Hill by the Divine Hall's diplomatic corps to the Tang Empire. The writer was Priest Qing Lixue of the Revelation Department. The content of the file was a detailed description of the battle between Ning Ke and Lu Yiqing at the side door of the academy. The focus of the description was, of course, on the divine skill that Ning Ke revealed at the end. You have seen that person. What do you think? The cold and solemn voice of the great divine priest of judgment sounded again from behind the bead curtain. Yi Hongyu listened quietly to the sound of the bead curtains hitting against each other. She said slowly, "Ning Ke's cultivation state is so fast that it has exceeded my expectations. As for the divine skill that the Revelation Department thought of, it seems to me that it is just a facade. Because according to the details, the Haotian divine flame that Ning Ke condensed from the qi of heaven and earth should have burst out from within the blade and not from nature." There was a dead silence in the Taoist hall. Through the details of the file, Yi Hongyu had some doubts about the real means of Ning Ke's knife. This doubt pointed to a very shocking fact, so there was a silence. After a long time, the great divine priest of judgment asked in a low voice, "Are you sure?" Yi Hongyu shook her head and said, "Back then, Mr. Ku had also shown his divine skills to the world. Furthermore, since Ning Ke's handmaiden had become a disciple of the divine priest of light, no one would suspect him without evidence. Even if they did, they would not be able to tell the world about it." The great divine priest of judgment looked at her, who was kneeling in front of him expressionlessly. Yi Hongyu calmly said, "I can do." The great divine priest of judgment looked at the girl's tranquil expression and felt a sense of impatience in his chest. He said angrily, "Then what is the use of you?" Yi Hongyu said after a moment of silence, "At least you have good taste." A deep, thunderous cough suddenly sounded from behind the bead curtain and could not be stopped. After a long time, the great divine priest of judgment stopped coughing and looked at her coldly through the bead curtain. He said, "Your body has been polluted by that devil, Lotus. You need to be purified. It is a good choice to choose the stone house to practice hard and hide from the world. During this time, don't bother with the affairs of the department." Yi Hongyu knew very well that the great divine priest's simple words were equivalent to stripping her of her position as the Grand Master of the Judicial Department. In fact, ever since she returned from the wilderness, she had lived in seclusion in the stone house and rarely cared about the affairs of the judicial department. However, ignoring and being deprived of the right to care were two different things. Now her strength was seriously damaged, and her realm had fallen to the middle level of see-through, and it was still going down. If even the position of the priest of the judicial department no longer existed, then the people in the divine hall who had suffered countless hardships in front of her might turn those mocking and contemptuous eyes into real actions. Yi Hongyu knelt in front of the great god's throne and remained silent. The great divine priest of judgment leaned back tiredly and supported his forehead with his hand. He looked at the girl outside the curtain with a trace of boredom and mockery in his deep eyes. As a giant of the divine hall, he absolutely could not accept that someone tried to maintain pride in front of the great god and refused to kneel down humbly. In the past years, because of Yi Hongyu's talent, the hierarch appreciated her, and he also thought highly of her. Together with the person in the temple, he could calmly watch her pride and even support her pride. But now, since she did not have the right to be proud, then let her be silent. I have written a letter to the temple about this matter. Your brother expressed his gratitude to me for handling it. The great divine priest of judgment looked at the girl outside the curtain indifferently, shattering her last psychological dependence. Sure enough, after hearing this, Yi Hongyu's expression became a little gloomy. Her body trembled slightly, and her eyebrows were full of self-mockery and disappointment. She was like a seemingly hard egg that finally had its thin outer shell broken, revealing the fragile inside. After an unknown amount of time, she seemed to finally wake up. A sad smile appeared on her face as she bowed to the god behind the bead curtain and said, "All these years, it is all thanks to the god's protection that I have today. Please allow this disciple to thank you for your great kindness." The great divine priest of judgment frowned and looked at the girl who bowed in front of the curtain. He suddenly felt that his decision seemed to be a little hasty. He always felt that the sad smile on the girl's lips, and the words that sounded a little desperate and sad, hid some meaning that he did not understand. After bowing, Yi Hongyu slowly stood up. Just before leaving, she looked at the great god on the black jade seat behind the curtain and said softly, "This is between the sword garret of South Jin Kingdom and the Academy. I think it is better for the judicial department not to interfere, even though this is something to be said after the fact." The great divine priest of judgment looked at her and suddenly coughed painfully again. He sternly scolded, "It is not terrible that your state has fallen. It is terrible that your Taoist heart is so timid. The West Hill Divine Palace rules the world, and the judicial department enforces the rules. Who dares to question this?" Yi Hongyu said no more and walked out of the Black Taoist temple. Standing at the top of the high stone steps outside the Taoist temple, she looked at the smoke in the fields outside the Peach Mountain. After a moment of silence, she suddenly sighed and said, "Someone is going to die again." The deacon who had handed her the dossier had accompanied her all the way to the outside of the Taoist temple. At this time, he was standing quietly beside her. Hearing her lament, he could not help but lament too. He whispered, "The great divine priest has been suffering from colds recently. He has been coughing badly and has a bad temper. Please do not take it to heart, priest. As for the sword garret, those who deserve to die will die." As the most powerful and terrifying great divine priest of the West Hill Divine Palace, he had already entered the knowing destiny state. He sat on the clouds and looked at the world as if he was an ant. Such a person had long been immune to all diseases. How could he catch a cold? How could he cough? If he didn't cough, how could he be grumpy? Yi Hongyu looked at the deacons of the judicial department who were looking at her mockingly and pitifully. She suddenly said sympathetically, "It is not easy to recover from being injured by the divine priest of light. The West Hill Divine Palace had a hierarch lord and 3 great divine priests. No matter if the person sitting on the great divine priest was old, sick, injured, or imprisoned, as long as he was alive, he would be the great divine priest worshipped by millions of people in the world." Sometime last year, the great divine priest of light, who had been imprisoned in the U prison for more than 10 years, rebelled and escaped. Then he died together with Master Yen Sei on a nameless mountain on the outskirts of Chang'an. There was an empty great divine priest of light in the West Hill Divine Palace. The great divine priest was waiting for someone else. The West Hill Divine Palace could not allow this situation to continue for too long. Therefore, when they knew that the great divine priest of light had left a successor in the world, the Divine Hall urgently needed to bring that successor back to the West Hill. This matter was still in a state of secrecy for the time being. If the people outside of the Divine Hall knew about this, they would probably have some doubts. Why did the people in the West Hill Divine Palace still choose the successor of the former Divine Priest of Light to take over the position of the Divine Priest of Light, even though he had betrayed the sect and brought great harm to the Divine Hall? But for the people in the West Hill Divine Palace, this matter was very natural. Because the great Divine Priest of Light who rebelled was still the great Divine Priest of Light. More importantly, for countless years, the inheritance of the three great divine priests of Peach Mountain had never been decided by the hierarch or the great divine priest, but by Haotian. The inheritance of the three great divine priests of Peach Mountain followed different paths. The inheritance of the great divine priest of judgment was a choice made by Haotian through the judgment of power. The inheritance of the great divine priest of revelation was a choice made by Haotian through the revelation of prophecy. The inheritance of the great divine priest of light was a choice made by Haotian through the continuation of light. The dying great divine priest of light found his successor in Chang'an. This must be the will of Haotian. Then that successor must be the future great divine priest of light. Especially after the news from the South Sea, the hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace and the great divine priest of revelation became more and more confident. They did not hesitate to let the great divine priest of light wait for the return of its true master. In the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street, Ning Ke looked at Qing Lixue in front of him and kept silent for a long time. In the Right King's Palace of the Wilderness, he had once met the priest of the Revelation Department of the Divine Hall. In that dispute, Qing Lixue's calm and even fair performance left a good impression on him. But today, looking at the silver-white hair of Qing Lixue, he felt very uncomfortable. Because Qing Lixue was a bigwig in the West Hill Divine Palace, but his attitude was so sincere and even humble. Especially when Sang Sang served tea, Qing Lixue's respectful look made Ning Ke easily have an illusion that this guy was his and Sang Sang's future son. Ning Ke picked up the teacup on the table and thought for a moment. He said, "I roughly understand the ins and outs of this matter, but I really can't promise you anything." Qing Lixue looked at him quietly and suddenly frowned. He said, "Although there have been some misunderstandings between the Divine Hall and the Academy these years, we still respect each other." Ning Ke said, "I respect Haotian Taoism very much." Qing Lixue sighed and said, "Junior sister Sang Sang will be the divine priest of light of the Divine Hall in the future. Including me, hundreds of millions of Haotian believers in the world have to kneel in front of her and dare not speak or look at her. But Mr. 13, you let her make the bed and serve tea here. Then where is the respect for Haotian Taoism? My state has fallen, but I can't be weak. I'll write another chapter. The update time must be very late. I don't know when I can write it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 409. Hearing this, Ning Ke looked at Sang Sang who was cooking in the backyard. After a moment of silence, he shook his head and said, "To be honest, I still feel that the whole thing is ridiculous. I watched her grow from a little girl to a little girl. I know she has something special about her, but I didn't expect it to be so special that it could alarm the West Hill Divine Palace." Qing Lixue said, "Even if younger sister Sang Sang is an extremely ordinary person, she is no longer ordinary since Haotian chose her through the Divine Priest of Light. And we will definitely carry out Haotian's will and bring her back to the Divine Hall." "I don't like to hear such words and tone." Ning Ke looked at the teacup in his hand and said after a moment of silence, "Because it makes me feel that you are threatening me. It makes me feel that you are trying to take her away from me." Qing Lixue looked at him quietly and said, "You can understand it from another perspective." Ning Ke took a sip of the cold tea and said mockingly, "Since you are determined to bring her back, how can I understand it? If I don't agree, will you just give up?" Qing Lixue shook his head. The divine priest of light can't be without a leader all the time. Ning Ke put down the teacup and looked into his eyes. "If I insist on not agreeing, what will the divine hall do?" Qing Lixue heard the toughness in his words. After a moment of silence, he said with a smile, "You should know what the divine priest of light means to the entire Haotian Taoism and the West Hill Divine Palace." "I'm not sure." Ning Ke still stared into his eyes and asked, "Even at the cost of a war?" Qing Lixue looked at him with a smile and said calmly, "If the successor of the divine priest of light is somewhere else in the world, the divine hall will find her even at the cost of the world's blood." Ning Ke said, "Since you said it somewhere else, then you and the bigwigs in the divine hall must know that Sang Sang is now in Chang'an, by my side." Qing Lixue said after a moment of silence, "So I am here to ask younger sister Sang Sang to go back." "The word 'please' sounds better." Ning Ke said, "But I want to know how determined the divine hall is." Qing Lixue frowned slightly and said, "Do you want to know if the divine hall will declare war on the Tang Empire because of this?" "Declare war on the academy? Do you think the Tang Empire and the academy will go to war with the divine hall because of junior sister Sang Sang?" Ning Ke thought of the bloodshed in Chang and many years ago and General Xiaohe, who was still alive and well. After a long silence, he shook his head and said, "The Empire and the Academy will not start a war with the Divine Hall over a little girl. But if you really want to take her away from me, I can tell you clearly that the Empire and the Academy will be involved in this war." Qing Lixue's face turned cold. It was not until now that he realized that junior sister Sang Sang was not as simple as a handmaiden whom he had been with for many years. It was also until now that he realized that Ning Ke really had the determination and ruthlessness to let the world flood for junior sister Sang Sang. Why should the Tang Empire and the Academy go to war with the Divine Hall because of your insolence? He sternly reprimanded, "Are the headmaster of the Academy and the Emperor of the Tang Empire shameless people like you who would not hesitate to cause chaos in the world for your own selfish desires?" Ning Ke's expression did not change. He looked at him and said, "Don't forget who I am. If that day really comes, I have enough ways to drag the Academy and the Empire into this mess." There was silence in the old brush pen shop. Qing Lixue looked at him and said with a bitter smile, "Why can't you imagine it better? Junior sister Sang Sang is not going to the West Hill to be a prisoner or to suffer. On the contrary, she will receive the most perfect education from Haotian Taoism and become the most honorable divine priest of light on Peach Mountain. There is no harm in this for the Tang Empire, the Academy, or you. So why do we have to fight? Is it really because of his own selfish desires that he does not want Sang Sang to go to the West Hill Divine Palace, that he does not want Sang Sang to become the great divine priest of light, and that he wants her to serve him for the rest of her life?" Ning Ke looked at the remaining tea in the cup and fell into a long silence. Then he suddenly raised his head and said, "Let me think about it." Qing Lixue looked into his eyes and said seriously, "The great divine priest of revelation cannot stay in Chang'an for long. I hope you can think about it seriously and not use it as an excuse to fool me." That night, Ning Ke brought Sang Sang to the Grand Secretary's mansion. Mrs. Zheng was overjoyed to see her daughter whom she had not seen for a few days. She held her daughter's hand and walked into the backyard, leaving the quiet study room to Ning Ke and the Grand Secretary. "What are your thoughts on this matter, my lord?" Ning Ke asked seriously. He wanted to find some spiritual support from her expression, such as a parent's reluctance to part with their daughter, but in the next moment, he realized that it was just wishful thinking. Grand Secretary Xing Jing's face showed some reluctance, but he was more excited and at a loss after the extreme surprise. For the believers of Haotian in the world, even if they were citizens of the Tang Empire, it would be a great honor to suddenly find out that their daughter could become the great divine priest of light of the West Hill Divine Palace. "I'm thinking if I should go back to my hometown and rebuild the ancestral hall. If it weren't for the blessings of my ancestors in heaven, how could my family have such a grand event?" Speaking of rebuilding the ancestral hall, even the rules have to be changed. Although there are no clear rules in the laws of the Tang Empire, according to the old rules set by the great divine priest of West Hill from the Chui family of Qinghe Prefecture more than 100 years ago, the ancestral hall of the Xing family can be compared to the rules set by the princes. Grand Secretary Xing Jing's face was full of joy, and he said in a trembling voice, "This is still within the territory of the Tang Empire, where the imperial power is supreme. If it were in the South Jin Kingdom or the Kingdom of Song, we could even rebuild the ancestral hall according to the imperial system. Mr. 13, how could I be so lucky?" Suddenly, he noticed Ning Kei's silence, and he smiled embarrassedly and said, I forgot myself. But at least I am better than the clan leader of the Chui family of Qinghe Prefecture. It is said that when the news of the West Hill choosing the great divine priest reached Qinghe Prefecture, the clan leader was so surprised that he became a fool. Ning Kei smiled bitterly and said, "Is it really that good to be the great divine priest of West Hill?" Zheng Jing was stunned, and his face was full of surprise. He thought that as a core disciple of the headmaster of academy, how could he ask such an absurd and even retarded question? For the people of the world, being the great divine priest of West Hill was more perfect than being an emperor. If this was not good, then what other good things could there be in the world? Xing Jing suddenly came to his senses, and he looked at him in disbelief and said, "You don't want Sang Sang to go to West Hill?" Ning Kei was silent for a long time, and then he said, "It's not that I don't want to, it's just that I haven't thought about it yet." Xing Jing said in a trembling voice, "Mr. 13, you saved my daughter from a difficult situation and have taken good care of her all these years. I am very grateful for that. I also know that the relationship between you and my daughter is not an ordinary master and servant. However, please consider this matter carefully and don't make a rash decision." Ning Kei did not say anything. Xing Jing thought of a possibility, but he felt that it was unlikely. He tugged at his beard and hesitated for a long time, and then he lowered his voice and said tentatively, "I heard that the canon does not allow the great divine priest to marry or marry." Ning Kei suddenly raised his head and looked at him, asking, "Really?" Xing Jing looked at Ning Kei's eyes that suddenly brightened, and he was startled, thinking that his wife's guess was true. Thinking that his guess might be true, Xing Jing suddenly forgot that Ning Kei was a student of the second floor of the academy, and subconsciously put on the airs of an elder. He stroked his beard and frowned, asking, "If Sang Sang doesn't go to West Hill, how will Mr. 13 arrange for my poor daughter in the future?" Ning Kei did not notice the change in his expression, and said, "I will marry her when she is over 16. Zheng Jing's fingers that were stroking his beard trembled, and 3 strands of beard fell off. He was waiting for Ning Kei to speak, and then he would argue with him. But he did not expect that Ning Kei would say that he would marry Sang Sang without any hesitation or concealment. "Wife?" Xing Jing asked in a trembling voice. Ning Kei shook his head. Xing Jing was slightly angry. Ning Kei shook his head and said, "Of course it's a wife. How can it be a crooked one?" Xing Jing relaxed a lot, and asked with a smile, "Will you take a concubine?" Ning Kei said bitterly, "I want to, but do you think it's possible?" Xing Jing's smile grew wider. His daughter might marry the core disciple of the headmaster of academy, and Ning Kei had promised not to take a concubine. With such a future, it would not be a pity if he did not become the great divine priest of West Hill. In that case, it's up to you whether Sang Sang goes to West Hill or not. Xing Jing, the Grand Secretary, had always been a very decisive person. Otherwise, he would not have directly divorced his wife and killed her servant after Sang Sang was killed by his wife, even with the pressure from the Empress. Therefore, after hearing Ning Kei's words and thinking about the pros and cons of the 2 choices, he did not hesitate to remove himself and his wife from this matter, and put all the pressure on Ning Quebec. Ning Kei said painfully, "Shouldn't we discuss this kind of thing?" Xing Jing stroked his slightly painful chin, and said while shaking his head, "Sang Sang is still in Mr. Ning's household register, and you two have a deep relationship. In terms of emotion and reason, Mr. Ning should also make the decision." Ning Kei suddenly realized that his future father-in-law was not someone who could be easily fooled. Xingjing looked at him and sneered, "Don't think that you can fool me and refuse the request of the Westhill Divine Palace just because you are a student of the second floor of the academy." The night was getting late. Mrs. Zeng walked out of the backyard with Sang Sang, and her face was full of reluctance. Xingjing pulled his wife aside and whispered a few words to her. Mrs. Zeng covered her mouth and was slightly shocked. When she looked at Ning Ke again, the look in her eyes was very different from before, and it was extremely loving. "I thought that Mr. Ning would come often in the future, so I ordered someone to prepare a guest room in the backyard." Mrs. Zeng looked at Ning Ke and said with a smile, "Why don't you rest here tonight?" Ning Ke suddenly felt that he had walked into the world of strange stories, and he had the urge to run away. "I have an urgent matter to attend to later." He stood up and asked Sang Sang to spend more time with his parents in the Grand Secretary's mansion, and then he left. He went to the second street of Spring Breeze Pavilion. Chao Xiaoshu's house was on this street. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 410. Chi 4 had been waiting outside the Chao mansion. Seeing that Ning Ke had finally appeared, he let out a sigh of relief and led him into the mansion, whispering the latest situation along the way. It was already late at night, but the hall of the Chao mansion was still brightly lit. Several people sat silently in the hall, and the atmosphere was somewhat depressing. When they looked at the old master sitting at the head of the table, they would always have a gentle smile on their faces, but the smile seemed a little forced. Chi 4 led Ning Ke into the hall. Everyone stood up, cupped their fists, bowed, and introduced themselves. Chang San, Chang Siwei. Lu Wu, Lu Si. Fei Lu, Fei Jingwei. Chen 7. The people in the Chao mansion today were all former leaders of the Fish Dragon Gang. After the Spring Breeze Pavilion case, their identities were exposed, and they could only leave the Fish Dragon Gang and return to the Imperial Court. Now, they had important positions in the Valiant Cavalry Battalion and the Bodyguard Office. Everyone was gathered here for that matter. Before Chao Xiaoshu left Chang'an, he had specially brought his brothers to Lin 47th Street to let Ning Ke meet them. Ning Ke knew the identity of these people. From the perspective of the secret guards, they were considered colleagues, so it was not strange for them to appear here. Chang San and the others looked at Ning Ke with a complicated expression. Before Chao Xiaoshu left, he had vaguely intended to entrust them and the Fish Dragon Gang to Ning Ke, but Ning Ke did not accept. They had always been puzzled about this, and did not understand why Chao Xiaoshu trusted him so much. However, 2 years had passed in a flash, and Ning Ke had long become a celebrity in Chang'an. Only then did they realize that second brother Chao had long seen through this man's extraordinary abilities. "This is Old Master Chao," Chi 4 introduced. Ning Ke looked at the white-haired old man, who had a worried expression on his face. For some reason, he felt a little annoyed. He frowned and said, he should not travel far with his parents around, but he does travel happily and freely. Old Master Chao sighed and explained for his son, "In the beginning, I wanted him to take the scholarly exams, and then I wanted him to seek an official position. I've restrained him for half his life. Now that he finally has a chance to get rid of all this, let him go." Ning Ke was slightly taken aback. He did not expect Old Master Chao to be so open-minded. He also thought about how Chao Xiaoshu had been the emperor of the underworld in Chang'an for many years. Old Master Chao, who came from a family of scholars, did not care about him at all. He thought that Old Master Chao was a smart person who had ideas but was not good at giving them. After figuring this out, he no longer had to hide from the old man. He looked at the people around him and said, "I have interrogated the South Jin Kingdom Sword Master. Second brother Chao must have fought with Lu Bai." There was a burst of exclamations in the hall. Chang Siwei's face was full of worry. They had gone through thick and thin with Chao Xiaoshu for many years and had a kind of almost foolish confidence in him. However, when they heard that the person who attacked was really the Sage of Sword, Lu Bai, they could not help but feel shocked and at a loss. The sage was the most powerful man in the world. Of Chao Xiaoshu. And how? Of Chao. Ch Ning Ke said, Lu Yiqing doesn't know the exact result of that battle. Chao Xiaoshu's sword was taken away, so he must have been seriously injured. But we don't know where he is now. Chi Fo scratched his head and said in a distressed tone, with second brother Chao's personality, he definitely wouldn't do something so stupid. What we need to confirm now is how serious his injuries are. Is he hiding in a small village or is he imprisoned by the South Jin Kingdom? Not in the Sword Pavilion. Ning Ke looked at the crowd and said, Lu Yiqing would not dare to lie about this, because the academy will keep him imprisoned until we find Chao Xiaoshu. Besides, the academy has already sent a letter to the Sword Garret to ask Lu Bai. Although the people present used to be famous in the underworld of Chang and were now important figures in the imperial court, they did not know much about the world of cultivators and did not know how to deal with it. When they heard Ning Ke's words and knew that the academy would personally come forward, they immediately felt relieved. Chang San added, His Majesty also knows about this. Tomorrow, he will write an official letter to the king of the South Jin Kingdom to ask for Chao Xiaoshu. I think the people of the South Jin Kingdom will consider it carefully. Chen Seven had been standing silently in the corner, hiding behind the crowd. It seemed that he was not used to being seen by so many people. Suddenly, he said, I think there is something wrong with this. Everyone looked at him, including Ning Quebec. Ning Ke had noticed that when everyone introduced themselves, only Chen Seven did not. At the same time, he remembered the description of the fish dragon gang in Chang An's Jianghu world. Chang 3 was cold, Chi 4 was ruthless, Lu V was vicious, Phase 6 was vicious, and Chen 7 was sinister. How sinister was Chen 7? The Sage of Sword, Lu Bai, attacked second brother Chao probably because he was eager to hunt, or because he wanted to suppress the Tang Empire's momentum, or because second brother Chao ate a grain from the Sword Garret. Chen Seven lowered his head and spoke slowly as if he could not feel the crowd's gaze. Although what he said was funny, his voice was as gloomy as a mouse in the shadows. That is not important. The important thing is, why did Lu Yiqing challenge the academy? Why did he take second brother Chao's sword, and why did he want everyone to know about this? I am not a cultivator, and I don't know what cultivators usually think. But I think that if cultivators are still human, then their way of thinking is no different from us ordinary people. Ning Ke nodded and said, I can prove that. Chen Seven slowly raised his head, and his small eyes shone with a dim light. Lu Bai is the most powerful man in the world, so he cannot be an idiot. It is possible for him to send his own brother to humiliate the academy. Even if he loses, he can use the academy to sharpen his brother's cultivation. It is also possible for him to punish second brother Chao and you for the disciple who died in the hands of the two of you in Spring Breeze Pavilion 2 years ago. But I don't think he will think that it is feasible to take second brother Chao's sword and make you think that second brother Chao is dead, so that his own brother will become blind. Ning Ke was silent. He recalled the battle at the side gate of the academy and confirmed that what Chen Seven said made sense. If he had not seen Chao Xiaoshu's sword in Lu Yiqing's hand, he would not have chosen to attack so fiercely. It was not good for him to blind the Sage of Sword, Lu Bai's brother. If I were Lu Bai, I would first defeat second brother Chao, who had entered the knowing destiny state, and then let my brother defeat Ning Quebec. That would be enough to make up for what happened in Spring Breeze Pavilion. There is no need for me to make the academy and the Tang Empire a mortal enemy. Chen Seven continued softly, according to the intelligence of the bodyguard office. When you entered the second floor of the academy, your name immediately spread throughout the cultivation world. Even though we are not cultivators, we all know that your name is in the tomes of arcane, and many details of the Spring Breeze Pavilion case have also been spread. The natural speed of transmission of information is definitely not that fast. At that time, there was already someone behind the scenes adding fuel to the fire. They wanted the sword Garrett of South Jin Kingdom to focus on second brother Chao and you. Then I believe that there was also someone behind these two incidents. Lu Yiqing holding second brother Chao's sword is one of them. Chen Seven looked at everyone calmly and said, there is only one place in the world that has the ability and courage to provoke the relationship between the Tang Academy and the sword Garrett of South Jin Kingdom, and also has the right to benefit from this matter. That is the West Hill Divine Palace. Outside the capital of South Jin Kingdom, there was an ancient black and white pavilion on the cliff. It was called the Sword Garret. The building of the Sword Garret led into the cliff. It was a big, quiet cave. The top of the cave reached the peak, and sunlight shone through. At the bottom of the cave, there was a green pond and a thatched hut. It was like a small world of its own. Lu Bai sat in his own small world and looked at the fine bubbles spurting out by the blind fish in the green pond. He slowly reached out and pushed his long hair behind his back. He asked indifferently, who can give me an explanation? The news of Lu Yiqing's defeat in the academy and his blindness had already spread to the South Jin Kingdom. Along with this news came 2 letters from the Tang Empire. One of the letters was written by the Tang Emperor himself, and it was now in the bedchamber of the king of South Jin Kingdom. The king was extremely angry, but also extremely helpless. The other letter was written by an old woman in the academy. It was now quietly placed beside Lu Bai's legs. The seal had been cut, and he had probably already read it. Beside the green pond, more than 10 important second-generation disciples of the sword Garret knelt. When they heard their master's question, they lowered their heads in silence and did not know how to answer. Lu Yiqing had been defeated in a direct challenge. How could they explain this? Lu Bai looked at the green pond in front of him and said expressionlessly, my own brother has become a blind man. Who can give me an explanation for this? A disciple of the sword Garret said indignantly, the academy is too ruthless. We must what? Revenge? Why do we need revenge? Lu Bai said coldly, swordsmanship is about the spirit and boldness of advancing forward. Since I wanted him to defeat and kill Ning Ke, then it was natural that he would be defeated and killed by Ning Quebec. Moreover, I wanted him to go to the academy to seek defeat so that he could cleanse his sword heart. The disciples were shocked speechless. Only then did they realize that their master had already expected Lu Yiqing to lose. Lu Bai glanced at the letter beside him and said in a cold voice, I just don't understand. I asked Yiqing to cleanse his own sword, but why did he bring Chao Xiaoshu's sword? Everything about the sage of sword, Lu Bai, was a sword, whether it was his loose black hair, the belt around his waist, the slightly swaying sleeves, his eyes, his back view, or his voice. When his voice became colder, the disciples of the sword Garret beside the pond seemed to see a divine sword slowly being pulled out of the ice. Their eyes were pierced by the sharp sword style and they began to tear up immediately. The disciples were terrified and kneeled on the ground, trembling and not daring to say a word. Lu Bai slowly turned around and looked at the disciples beside the pond coldly. He said, my brother is an idiot in everything except swordsmanship. Because of his idiocy, he didn't even think of a way to provoke Ning Ke with Chao Xiaoshu's sword. Then who helped him think of it? There was dead silence in the cliff cave behind the sword Garret. After a long time, one of the disciples who was kneeling beside the pond slowly straightened up. Then he stood up and took 2 steps towards the pond. He bowed deeply but did not speak. Lu Bai looked at this disciple and said coldly, is the judicial department better than the sword Garret? There is one more chapter. It was written before 1130. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 411. The blind fish in the little green pond were still spitting bubbles. The yellow grass by the pond was still yellow and weak. They were like the companions in the hut. Hearing Lu Bai's question, the disciple who walked to the pond was shocked. He had decided to confess everything, but he did not expect that his master had already known his true identity. Lu Bai said, "I have raised you and taught you for 7 years. You can even keep a cold sword warm. I did not expect that the judicial department was born to be a block of ice." The sword garret disciple was silent for a long time before he bowed again and sincerely apologized. "I'm sorry. I didn't expect that it would end up like this." Lu Bai said expressionlessly, "If the judicial department wants to borrow the sword of the sword garret to kill someone, they should tell me in advance. Taking without asking is not borrowing, but stealing." The disciple sighed and said, "It is my duty. I do not want to do this." "I know you do not want to do this," Lu Bai repeated tiredly. The disciple slowly straightened his body and calmly looked at Lu Bai across the pond. The fact that he could withstand the fierce sword style from Lu Bai showed that his real cultivation state was much higher than usual. Of course, even if his cultivation state was several levels higher, he would still not be a match for Lu Bai. But there was no fear on his face. The sage of sword Lu Bai was the most powerful man in the world. He was feared by countless cultivators. But he was a deacon of the West Hill Divine Palace. His orders came from the Black Taoist Temple in Peach Mountain. In Lu Bai's words, he borrowed Chao Xiaoshu's sword by virtue of his authority to manage the sword garret. Then he lent it to Lu Yiqing, who was about to go to Chang'an, and said a few words to him. Taking without asking was indeed not borrowing, but stealing. But since the West Hill Divine Palace wanted to borrow the sword to kill someone, then borrowing was borrowing. Even if it was stealing in the eyes of the world, it was still borrowing. After all, Lu Bai was a visiting professor of West Hill. He had to follow Hao Tian's orders. What could he do to him? Whether Prince Longqing is dead or alive, I think he is ruined. Lu Bai looked at him and said. The disciple replied respectfully, "Yes." Lu Bai said again, "I heard that Yi Hongyu was also ruined after coming back from the wilderness." The disciple said calmly, "Yes." Lu Bai laughed and said, "Will you take over the position of Grand Master after returning to Peach Mountain?" That disciple also laughed, using silence to express his acknowledgement. Lu Bai smiled even more happily and said, "Doesn't that mean you can become the great divine priest of judgment in the future?" The disciple smiled without saying a word. The smile on Lu Bai's face suddenly disappeared. He looked at the disciple and said expressionlessly, "Although it is my honor as a teacher that a disciple of the sword garret can inherit the position of great divine priest, I suddenly thought of something. If you really become the great divine priest of judgment, it will be inconvenient for me to kill you." The disciple's body stiffened as he looked at the other side of the pond. "Since you are not the great divine priest of judgment, then you have to pay a price for stealing." The disciple's expression suddenly turned cold. He wanted to say something, but he found that there was a hint of sweetness in his mouth. There was something soft and slippery between his teeth. Then he realized that it was his own tongue. Immediately after, his head was severed from his neck and fell to the ground beside the pond. It rolled around and rolled into the green pond. A moment later, a few streaks of blood appeared in the pond. The blind fish smelled the taste of its food and began to spit bubbles more cheerfully. The disciples of the sword garret who had been silently kneeling beside the pond came up and began to clean up the headless corpse. They noticed that the neck cavity was smooth and bloodless, and the fracture seemed to be covered by a transparent film. They could clearly see the trachea, esophagus, bones, and blood. They felt a little disgusted. To Lu Bai, killing an important figure of the judicial department of the Divine Hall was as easy as killing a mouse. His expression did not change at all. However, when his gaze landed on the letter from the academy, his brows gradually furrowed. Find Chao Xiaoshu and send him safely back to Chang'an City. Exchange for my brother. The disciples of the sword garret looked at each other and left with the order. At this time, a middle-aged man walked in from outside. He looked at the floating blood bubbles in the green pond and sighed softly. He walked behind Lu Bai and asked respectfully, "Senior brother, has the problem been solved?" Lu Bai said, "If killing could solve the problem, then the world would be much better in my eyes." The middle-aged man said bitterly, I heard that the great divine priest of judgment valued him very much. This time, he really wanted him to go back to Peach Mountain to take over Yi Hongyu's position. Senior brother, you could have cut off one of his hands. Why did you have to kill him? After a moment of silence, Lu Bai said, bring me a pen and paper. Sunlight poured down from the entrance of the cave on the peak and condensed into a beam that shrouded the green pond, the hut, and the person beside the pond. Lu Bai sat beside the pond under the sunlight and thought for a long time. Then he picked up the pen and paper beside him and slowly and casually scribbled on the yellowish paper. He was not writing, he was drawing. The soft ink pen walked on the paper that could not be spread flat. The lines were twisted and knotted and trembled from time to time. A few simple strokes formed a hollow, long and narrow object with difficulty, but it could not be seen what it was. The format was very clumsy, and it looked like the work of a naughty child. However, such a clumsy and simple painting seemed to exhaust Lu Bai's energy. Under the reflection of the water, his cheeks looked a little pale and haggard. The middle-aged man glanced at the painting and his body suddenly stiffened. Can you tell what I drew? Lu Bai asked. After a moment of silence, the middle-aged man said in a slightly hoarse voice, Senior brother, you drew a sword. Lu Bai said with satisfaction, you can tell that it is a sword. Junior brother, it seems that your state has improved. The middle-aged man forcibly suppressed his shock and asked, Senior brother, who are you going to give this sword to? Lu Bai said calmly, to West Hill, to Yi Hongyu. The middle-aged man could no longer control his emotions. He knelt behind Lu Bai and said in a trembling voice, Senior brother, why did you do this? Why did you send it to the Tao addict? Lu Bai looked at the paper in his hand and said, because after the divine priest of light died in Cheng, and only this woman in the whole Peach Mountain still made me admire her. But the sword garret and the judicial department have broken up. The middle-aged man said anxiously in a trembling voice, if Yi Hongyu really understood your sword style, won't she become a great enemy of the sword garret in the future? Lu Bai said, even without my sword, the Tao addict can still cross the threshold again. I just hope that she can do it faster. He raised his head and looked at the sunlight falling on the peak. He said expressionlessly, the old judge lent a sword to Yiqing, so I will lend a sword to Yi Hongyu. The purpose of lending a sword was to kill. In a remote stone house in the Peach Mountain of West Hill. Priest, I am just a messenger. Please don't take it to heart. Chen Bachi looked at Yi Hongyu in front of him. His eyes flickered on the loose green Taoist robe on her, and then fell on her beautiful and charming face again. He used to be the commander of the cavalrymen of Divine Hall. Although he was forced by Ning Ke to accept the punishment of the Black Ink Garden disciples when they encountered the horse gang, he was beaten with thorns and stripped of all his duties. But he still had the strength of the upper see-through state, so he still had a high status in the judicial department. In the past, his direct superior was Prince Long Qing, but the person he truly feared was Yi Hongyu in front of him. Even if Yi Hongyu was in such dire straits now, he still felt a little difficult to breathe in front of her. He naturally used the old title and spoke very carefully. But after all, things were changing. Everyone in the Divine Hall knew that the great divine priest of judgment had suspended Yi Hongyu from her duties as the priest and asked her to meditate and reflect. Perhaps because of the influence of this matter, Chen Bachi's eyes became more presumptuous than before. While Yi Hongyu was calmly looking out of the house, his eyes moved back and forth on her beautiful cheeks and body. The reason why Yi Hongyu, Mo Shanshan, and Lu Qinjia were called the three addicts of the world was not only because of their high cultivation states, but also because they were all very beautiful. Yi Hongyu had always been very beautiful. Her figure had always been very good and very attractive. Now, her delicate and alluring body was shrouded in a wide green Taoist robe. However, Chen Bachi had seen too many images of her wearing a red short skirt. At this moment, the wide green Taoist robe seemed to have disappeared, revealing a pair of straight, tight, and smooth thighs. The young girl was still beautiful and attractive. And because of her current gloomy situation, her timidity made her beauty more real, making some people have the courage to possess this beauty. Chen Baqi's eyes were a little obscene, but he did not dare to do so in his heart, because he did not have the courage. It had nothing to do with the majestic memories of the Tao addict in his heart, but related to what he was going to say today. Lord Luo Kadi is the commander of the Divine Guards and the trusted aide of the Hierarch Lord. You should be very clear about his cultivation state, priest. If he is willing to participate in the fight for the Divine Priest of Judgment, the chances of winning are very high. Seeing Yi Hongyu turn around, Chen Baqi respectfully bowed and said, if priest thinks this is feasible, the commander will personally come to express his affection and determination to you. He also said that as long as you agree, he will immediately go to the Hierarch Lord to propose marriage. Yi Hongyu looked at the seemingly respectful old subordinate in front of her and was silent for a long time. Then she calmly said, give me some time to think about it. Chen Baqi said repeatedly, of course, of course. Yi Hongyu slowly closed the door of the stone house and then sat back on the stone bed shrouded in darkness. For a Hautian Taoism woman who had almost nothing left but her face and body, a dignified commander of the Divine Guards coming to propose marriage was not only of course, but also a surprise. Her expression was still calm, but her body under the loose green Taoist robe could not help but tremble. The stone bed made a squeaking sound, as if it would collapse at any time. The more I write about Yi Hongyu, the more I like her. I have decided not to let her fall in love, marry, and be alone for the rest of her life. Is this the so-called possessiveness? See you all tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 412. In the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine in the Wilderness, Lotus not only polluted her flesh and blood, but also her state of mind. Her originally clear Taoist heart was covered with dust because of something in the past. Moreover, because her knowing destiny state was not stable, there was no possibility for her to recover after she forcefully lowered her state. If she was an ordinary cultivator, she would have given up in despair when encountering such a setback. But she was not an ordinary cultivator. She was a Tao addict who was obsessed with Taoism. She was very clear that all setbacks were tests from Haotian. As long as her Taoist heart was strong enough, she could turn all of these into the most beautiful scenery on the long road of cultivation. In the wilderness, she had seen the stone array tactics set by the Divine Priest of Light 1,000 years ago. She had seen Mr. Kuzhauran's sword that split the heaven and earth. These scenery were silently waiting for her to admire and absorb. But other people in the West Hill Divine Palace did not know. The great Divine Priest of Judgment did not know. Luo Kadi, the commander of the Divine Guards who wanted to force her to marry, did not know. The result of not knowing was that the West Hill Divine Palace not only treated her with indifference, mockery, contempt and humiliation, but also deprived her of the time she needed the most. Yi Hongyu needed time. Time to see through the scenery and see through the paper covering her eyes. So she could calmly ignore those complicated gazes and those harsh words. She could appear timid and even humble. She could kneel in front of the Divine Priest and respectfully act as if she was a hopeless waste. However, the situation she was facing now had suddenly become difficult. Although the commander of the Divine Guards, Luo Kadi, was a rare master in the Divine Hall and the most trusted subordinate of the hierarch, Yi Hongyu would never consider marrying him. Not because of his age, not because of his appearance, not even because she had no feelings for him. Because for the sake of cultivation, she could not have any feelings. But because he wanted her to marry him. He wanted her to marry him, not he begged her to marry him, not he asked her to marry him. This was a humiliation she could not accept. Yi Hongyu silently sat on the stone bed, her hands clutching the green Taoist robes so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Do I really have to go back to the temple? Chin Pippi, you damn fatty, you bitch, you idiot. I only scared you when you were young. Why did you run away? Why don't you go back to the temple now? If you don't go back, my brother won't forgive me. How can I go back? Perhaps it was because she thought of Chin Pippi, the hateful guy, or because of her brother. Yi Hongyu could no longer control her emotions. She lowered her head silently, and her eyes were full of grievance, sadness, and timidity. At this time, she was no longer the Tao addict or a loser. She was just a very ordinary girl. When an ordinary girl was forced to marry, she would naturally get angry easily. Hence, Yi Hongyu became very angry at this moment. She looked coldly at the closed door of the stone house and thought that she should kill Chinbachi, Luokadi, and everyone who dared to look at her like that. However, the anger in her eyes gradually turned into frustration and self-mockery because she had no more time. She could not return to the temple. It seemed that she could only angrily and helplessly sit by the stone bed. At this moment, someone arrived outside the stone house. "Sir, there's a letter for you." The person outside the stone house did not call her a priest. He did not deliberately show respect, but such a simple sentence showed enough respect. This was the respect that only she could feel. Yi Hongyu raised her eyebrows slightly, and her expression changed slightly. In the divine hall, she had not been so respected for a long time. The door of the stone house opened. She recognized that the person was a very ordinary deacon of the judicial department. The deacon respectfully handed over a letter with both hands. Then, without saying anything, he turned and left the stone house. The door of the stone house closed again, and darkness reappeared. Yi Hongyu walked back to the stone bed and sat down. She quietly looked at the letter in her hand and did not speak for a long time. The envelope was made of ordinary craft paper. There was nothing special about it, and there was no writing on the cover. She used to be the Grand Master of the Judicial Department. Although she did not manage the specific affairs of the department, she still had a pair of eyes that could see through all the details in the world and find clues from them. The seemingly ordinary craft paper was the most common craft in the paper workshop in Danzhou. Then this letter came from the South Jin Kingdom. Yi Hongyu was sure that she did not know anyone in the South Jin Kingdom, so she did not know who the writer was. She opened the envelope, took out the letter inside, and slowly unfolded it. The letter was made of yellowish papyrus. There was a pattern drawn on the papyrus. The person who drew the picture was obviously not good at painting. The lines were crooked and trembling. It was extremely ugly and clumsy. It was impossible to understand what he drew. Yi Hongyu looked at the long and narrow hollow pattern on the yellowish paper. Her fingers, which were holding the two corners of the paper, trembled slightly. She did not speak for a long time. She understood what was drawn on the paper. It was a sword. The sword of the Sage of Sword, Liu Bai. The kingdom of Yu was south of the South Jin Kingdom and east of the Great River. It faced the relatively quiet South Sea, so the fishing port was much more prosperous and lively than the one in the Kingdom of Song. A young man in a cotton shirt walked out of a fishing boat. He stretched towards the sun and then squinted his eyes, signaling his subordinates to complete the following tasks. This young man's appearance was exceptionally handsome. The severe scar on his cheek didn't make his face appear sinister. Instead, it made him look more composed. He squinted at the red rising sun and felt the wet sea breeze on his cheeks. Suddenly, he felt an unprecedented satisfaction. He said in a low voice, "It doesn't seem bad to live like this for the rest of my life." The young man's subordinates were arguing fiercely with the fish and salt merchants. But these things seemed to have nothing to do with him. He just looked at the sun in silence. The people in the fishing port only knew that this young man was a big merchant from the north. He was in the salted fish business. No one knew what kind of dazzling life this young man had before he started selling salted fish, and what kind of reputation he had in the world. The young man used to be a prince of the Yen Kingdom. He was the most famous young powerhouse in the West Hill Divine Palace. He was a brilliant and beautiful man who had planted several peach blossoms on the threshold of the Knowing Destiny state. But now, he was a merchant selling fish. Even though he had been shot in the chest by Ning Ke and his cultivation state was destroyed, even though he had abandoned himself to fight for food with the beggars in the broken temple, he was still Prince Longqing. Without cultivation state, he still had his fists. Even if his fists could not resist the wind and rain of the world, he still had his wisdom. Most importantly, since he was not dead, he wanted to live a better life. In half a month, he unified the beggar gang inside and outside the capital of the Yan Kingdom and became the gang leader. Then, he took a part of the gang's wealth and some loyal subordinates to the Song Kingdom. He opened a wine shop and defeated all his peers on the street in a short time. Then, he sold those wine shops, tea houses, and restaurants to an official of the Song Kingdom at half price. With 1,000 taels of silver, he started a peddling business. He bought salted fish from the Yu Kingdom and sold them to the South Jin Kingdom or the Yan Kingdom. The business was good. Sometimes, Longqing could not help but sigh. It seemed that he could do everything well. In such a short time, he had become a big merchant. What was there to be dissatisfied with? However, looking at the salted fish in the bamboo basket, he could not help but think, even if he became the richest merchant in the world, what was the difference between him and the salted fish in the basket? I am in an extremely bad state today. I have a problem with my emotions. This is the only chapter. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 413. It was common to feel emotional about the sea, but it was rare to feel emotional about salted fish. However, when he thought about what had happened to him in the past year, even though he was facing a basket of salted fish, Longqing could not help but sigh. However, he was very clearly aware that any emotions like sighing and sighing with emotion were too unnecessary to him right now. Moreover, it would cause his mind that had just calmed down with great difficulty to once again feel the pain and despair that was difficult to restrain. So, he silently prepared to leave the fishing port. Suddenly, he stopped in his tracks. His exquisite leather shoes pressed against the wet and slippery ground as he slowly turned his body around. He saw a boat rising and falling in the waves in the distance, which was full of morning light. Longqing's eyes were still much sharper than ordinary people's, and he saw a Taoist in indigo standing on the boat. The Taoist in indigo on the boat looked ordinary and there was nothing special about him, but he couldn't move his eyes away because his body became extremely stiff because of the shock. Fishermen and coolies carried heavy catches on their backs and walked through the slippery deck. On the shore, merchants were smoking cigarettes and shouting arrogantly. Seabirds were flying back and forth between the surface of the sea and the ship's mast. The fishing port of Yu country was busy and noisy as usual. It seemed that no one had seen that small boat. Longqing silently looked at the boat and the Taoist on the boat from a distance of hundreds of feet. His eyes were uneasy with the ups and downs of the waves in the distance. He was not a cultivator now, but he still had his insight. It was clear that the Taoist in indigo must be a cultivator, and he couldn't see through him at all. Even he, who was once powerful, couldn't see through him. The Taoist in indigo on the boat in the distance stood at the bow of the boat with his hands behind his back. He slightly raised his head to look at the rising sun in the east, and his whole body seemed to melt in the reddish morning light. Looking at the back of the Taoist in indigo, Longqing suddenly had an impulse to run away. At this moment, a calm but oppressive voice sounded in his mind. Is there really such a thing as satisfaction in the world? The Taoist in indigo on the distant sea did not turn around, so he couldn't see whether he spoke or not. But Longqing knew that the voice in his mind was the Taoist's question. Hearing this question, his handsome eyebrows slightly frowned, and he seemed to be in pain. He lowered his head to look at a struggling shrimp in the mucus at his feet, and murmured, "What can I do if I can't be satisfied?" Then, he raised his head and looked at the Taoist in indigo on the boat in the distance. With some resentment and frustration, he said, "The light has abandoned itself, and the darkness disdains to kill itself. What right do a good-for-nothing like me have to complain? What kind of life can I hope for? The Taoist's voice sounded again in Long Qing's mind from thousands of feet away. You have experienced so many things in the past year, but you still don't understand the real relationship between light and darkness. You've experienced so many things in the past year. Don't tell me you still don't understand the true relationship between light and darkness? Long Qing thought of the dream when he was climbing the mountain in the academy. It was a dream that made him extremely painful, proud, glorious, and ultimately frustrated. Thinking of the boundless golden light in the dream, he suddenly understood something. His body suddenly became cold and began to tremble uneasily under the late spring sun. But that is not my original belief. He stared at the Taoist in indigo on the boat in the distance. His trembling voice was like the wind on the mast. It came out from his lips and teeth stiffly and coldly, with endless despair. The Taoist in indigo did not turn around. He still looked at the red morning sun with his hands behind his back. Can belief satisfy you? Long Qing replied, it used to be. The Taoist in indigo was silent. Long Qing lowered his head and looked at the struggling shrimp at his feet. He asked painfully, is this really okay? The Taoist in indigo said, yes. Long Qing asked with some confusion, is it worth it? The Taoist in indigo said, it depends on whether you are satisfied or not. If you are satisfied with the present, it is not worth it. If you are not satisfied, it is worth it. I have always thought that there is no real satisfaction in the world, so I think it is worth it no matter when. In the end, it came back to the original problem of satisfaction. Long Qing forcibly suppressed his confusion, shock, and helplessness. He frowned and thought hard. In a long silence, he recalled the past and guessed his future life. Was he really satisfied? In capital Cheng, he led the beggars to fight for food and territory. He stole money by kidnapping and cheating. Finally, he earned a sum of money and went to the kingdom of Song to open a shop and sell salted fish to earn money. Just like that, he lived a peaceful and happy life and became an ordinary successful businessman. He married a beautiful and gentle wife, had 2 concubines, and had many children. Many years later, when he was old and made sure that no one in Yan Kingdom was after him, he secretly took his family back to capital Cheng. He knelt on the royal road outside the palace and pointed at the equally old emperor. He trembled and told his grandson that Grandpa had a good relationship with the emperor, but he should have been sitting there. Then, he was about to die. He asked his family to carry him to the West Hill Divine Kingdom. He came to the foot of the holy mountain full of peach blossoms and squeezed into the crowd of sick women who came to pray to heaven for medical help. Then, he weakly lay on the stretcher and watched the indifferent and proud cavalrymen of Divine Hall and the black-robed deacons pass by. He looked at the majestic Taoist temples on the high ground. 2 lines of tears flowed down his wrinkled cheeks and he cried weakly, I should have been sitting there. That kind of life was right. For that kind of life, it was worth doing anything, even if he had to betray his original belief and accept the most painful spiritual baptism. Long Qing stood in the morning light by the sea and stood in the smell of salted fish and sea breeze. He was unconscious and didn't smell the stench. He was like a soulless body. Suddenly, he knelt down. With a crisp sound, his knees crushed the struggling shrimp in the mucus in front of him. He looked at the boat hundreds of feet away and the body of the Taoist in indigo. He put his hands on the ground and knelt down. Tears flowed down his face silently. He trembled and said, Please guide my way. The voice of the Taoist in indigo sounded in his mind again, Follow me. Long Qing, who was kneeling on the ground, was a little confused. He didn't know how to approach the boat, nor how to follow the back of the Taoist in indigo on the boat. When he raised his head, he found that he was no longer in front of the fishing port, but a vast blue sea. Seabirds fell into the sea from time to time, disturbing the morning light and the color of the sea. The back of the Taoist in indigo was only 2 steps away from him. He didn't know when he had come to the boat. Long Qing looked at the Taoist in indigo standing at the bow of the boat and was shocked speechless. When he saw the picture on the side of the boat, he couldn't help but narrow his eyes. The South Sea was much calmer than the East Sea, but the wind and waves were still very strong. Ships that could sail in the South Sea, no matter their size, were very particular. Before the construction of the ship, the wood used for the ship had to be piled up in the shipyard for a long time, exposed to the wind, rain, and sun. Only after the stress was relieved could it be used. In other words, any ship wood was dead wood. However, at this time, a peach blossom grew on the side of the boat. A new peach blossom grew from the dead wood. It was a black peach blossom, slightly trembling in the sea breeze and threatening in the morning light. I have something to report to you. In the past 2 days, I really have emotional problems, and I really can't write. That's all I have to take responsibility for. I will change it as soon as possible and will never miserably step into the same mistakes as last month. Fortunately, I can have a day off tomorrow. I will deal with the details and emotions, and then I must put pressure on myself. I will have 3 chapters on Sunday and 3 chapters on Monday. If I feel right, then I hope that the 3 chapters can last for 2 more days. I bow to you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 4:14. Looking at the clansmen's formation, the woman knew that what she was most afraid of had finally happened. Looking at the mud on her body and smelling the stench, she thought about what might happen. Fear and grievance intertwined in her heart, and tears flowed down uncontrollably. She looked at the chief and asked in a trembling voice, "What happened?" The strong man looked at her angrily and growled, "You put a man from another place in the house, and you dare to ask us what happened? You unfaithful B***tch, you're a disgrace to the whole clan." The woman lowered her head in silence, panicked and didn't know what to say. Although she wanted to explain that nothing had happened between her and the man from another place, she knew that the clansmen wouldn't believe her. More importantly, she knew very well that she was indeed unfaithful and wanted something to happen between her and the man from another place. The chief coughed lightly and stopped the villagers from smashing the house. He walked to the woman, looked at her slightly lowered head, and glanced at her plump breasts. He sighed and said, "Lindsay, although you are from Ueluan, can we not treat you well after you married into our village?" The woman lowered her head and begged with a trembling voice, "Thank you for taking care of me all these years, 4th elder master and the clansman." The chief's face suddenly turned cold. He said, "After Brother Ching died, I made the decision to let you remarry. You refused and said that you wanted to keep your chastity for Brother Ching. So we did as you said. But what are you doing now?" Hearing this, the woman raised her head and looked at the strong man. She thought sadly, "Chief, you want me to remarry your son? How can this be? When Brother Ching fell off the cliff and died while picking herbs, he was by his side. Who knew what had happened at that time?" At this moment, Chao Xiaoshu walked out of the house. The villagers saw that the man from another place didn't run away and even dared to appear in front of them. They became even angrier and brandished their hoes, ready to beat him to death. However, the clan elder strangely stopped the crowd. Chao Xiaoshu had been listening for a while in the house. Looking at the situation, he knew what had happened. When he was in Chang'an, he knew that the people of the Great River Nation were conservative and traditional, especially women in rural villages and towns, had an extremely low status. However, he didn't expect that such a storm would arise. He walked in front of the clan leader and gave a few sincere words of explanation. The clan leader expressionlessly shook his head and said, "This matter concerns the reputation of our clan. How can we let such a shameless woman go so easily?" Chao Xiaoshu said calmly, "If I really had an affair with her, would the clan leader punish me?" The chief looked at him and said after a moment of silence, "I know you are a Tang, so as long as you apologize and leave a sum of money as compensation, you can leave." Chao Xiaoshu glanced at the trembling woman and asked, "What are you going to do with her?" Before the chief could say anything, the strong man fiercely said, drown him in the pig cage. The words pig cage seemed to have a strange allure to these villagers. Immediately, shouts rang out in the small courtyard. They all shouted that they wanted to drown the woman in the pig cage, and then strip her naked and beat her with a paddle. Xiao Xiaoshu looked around and saw the greedy and obscene looks in the men's eyes. He looked at their twisted faces because of excitement and said softly, "It seems that we can kill these people." The small courtyard under the big banyan tree suddenly became quiet. The clansmen seemed to think that they had heard something, but they could not believe what they had heard. The chief's face suddenly became gloomy. He looked at Xiao Xiaoshu and was about to say something. However, before he could speak, Xiao Xiaoshu turned to look at the woman and asked gently, "Do you think we should kill these people?" The woman's body was slightly stiff, and she came to her senses after a moment. She had been desperate, but now, looking at Xiao Xiaoshu's gentle expression, she felt that hope was returning to her body. She looked at the hateful clansman, and her body suddenly trembled violently. She cried and said, "I am not from this village. I am from the forest of Yueluan Kingdom. I was sold here by human traffickers. My husband is dead. They want me to marry the chief's son. I don't want to marry, I don't want to marry." She had never said these words to outsiders because there were no outsiders in this remote village. No one believed her words, and even if they did, no one dared to sympathize with her. So she wanted to know the story of the outside world, and wanted to have a story with the outside world. At this moment, she finally shouted these words because she wanted to live. "It's good that you killed them." Xiao Xiaoshu looked at the people in the yard and asked, "Who did you kill?" The woman pointed at the white-haired chief and the strong man, and said in a trembling voice, "This father and son deserve to die the most." Xiao Xiaoshu took 2 steps forward. The clansmen in the yard raised the hoes and iron forks in their hands, wanting to hit him. The fence was trampled by these people. Xiao Xiaoshu picked up a piece of bamboo. Then he waved it twice. The heads of the chief and the strong man flew up. The clansmen looked at this scene in a daze, and their faces suddenly turned pale. Someone shouted, and everyone fled in all directions. No one cared about the 2 bodies on the fence. Murder. Go and report it to the government. Frightened and desperate cries rang out in the village, startling the fish in the pond and disturbing the birds in the banyan tree. It tore apart the peace and rules that had lasted for thousands of years. The headless bodies of the chief and his son were still lying in the simple and crude yard. The woman's face was pale, and her body was trembling slightly. But the luster in her eyes was brighter than it had been in the past 10 years. Xiao Xiaoshu looked at her and asked, "Do you still miss this village and this yard?" The woman shook her head and murmured, "How could I?" Xiao Xiaoshu said, "Then come with me." The woman looked at his eyes in surprise, and her eyes were full of surprise. She said nervously, "Okay." She was very nervous, so she didn't ask where he was going. She wanted to go with him. As long as she could leave this village, she was willing to go wherever he went. However, at this moment, Xiao Xiaoshu suddenly became silent. He frowned slightly, as if he was hesitating. Some words should not be said at this time. The woman's body was slightly stiff. After a moment of silence, she said bitterly, "Yes, I am a shameless and dissolute woman. How can you bring me home? You'd better give me some money, and I will live on my own. In the end, I will still ask you for money, but I don't care if you laugh at me." Xiao Xiaoshu looked at her and said, "I will only give money to one kind of woman." The woman's face was pale, and she said miserably, "I see. Unfortunately, although I am a dissolute widow, and I want to give my body to you, I am not willing to earn money from you with my body." Xiao Xiaoshu looked at her eyes quietly, and said gently, "You misunderstood me. I mean, I will only give money to my wife, but I don't know if you are willing to give it to me." The woman was stunned for a long time before she came to her senses. She rubbed her eyes, wanting to cry, but also feeling a little embarrassed. Xiao Xiaoshu looked at her and smiled. He went into the house, packed his luggage, and then walked into the yard. Looking at the woman who was still in a daze, he said, "Let's go." The woman took the luggage from his hand. The two then left. Ning Ke had been thinking about three things. The first thing he wanted to know was why the Sadhu Daosher was able to find him in Cheng, and with such accuracy. Was there someone behind the scenes who was behind this? Second, if the judicial department of the Divine Hall was involved in the sword garret's provocation of the academy and the theft of Chao Xiaoshu's sword, then where would the sword garret be if not Chao Xiaoshu? Third, how to reply to the West Hill Divine Palace's request to take Sang Sang away. The last two things were related to the West Hill Divine Palace. Thinking of Qing Lishua's attitude towards the judicial department, he felt that he should go to the Southern Gate Temple, at least to inquire about some things. The great divine priest of revelation was now in the Southern Gate Temple. To negotiate with such a bigwig, he must first of all, of course, unify the opinions of his side, so that they could work together. Girls must have some dreams in life. Look at the Tao addict, her dream is very simple. She wants to walk to the end of the long road of cultivation. Look at Situilan, she wants to be the greatest female general in the history of the Tang Empire. Even Tang Xiaotang wants to be the most powerful woman in the world. Ning Ke stood behind Sang Sang and muttered. Sang Sang squatted by the well, concentrating on pickling the small yellow croaker. She did not want to talk to him, nor did she want to discuss this matter with him. Only with dreams can there be pursuits. Only with pursuits can life be fulfilling. A woman without dreams will eventually become a lifeless fish eyeball, a salted fish that cannot turn over a new leaf. Looking at her thin back, Ning Ke sighed and said, "Of course I don't want you to leave. But since you have the ability, it would be a pity to waste your time on daily necessities. I'm afraid that when you grow old, you will be afraid of your current choice." Sang Sang placed the salted fish in the bamboo basket and washed her hands in the cool well water. She turned to look at him and said, "I've thought about it carefully. I still don't want to go to the West Hill." Ning Ke asked, "Why?" Sang Sang said seriously, "It's the same old problem. Who will cook for you after I leave?" Ning Ke said, "This is indeed a troublesome problem. It's easy to find a few more maids. The problem is that I can't sleep well without you." After a while, he shook his head and said with emotion, "But I can't let the West Hill Divine Palace lose the great divine priest of light just because there is no one to cook for me and I can't sleep well. This matter will be recorded in the history books. My body will definitely be dug up by the future generations." That night, the master and the servant had a very deep conversation about this matter. They talked until late at night before reaching a preliminary conclusion and falling asleep wearily. The next morning, Ning Ke and Sang Sang washed up and had breakfast. When they were about to go to the Southern Gate Temple to visit the great divine priest of revelation, they suddenly heard the ritual music coming from the distance. The neutral and peaceful ritual music gradually approached Lin 47th Street from afar. Wherever the music reached, there was first a noisy discussion and then absolute silence. Ning Ke was a little surprised. He pushed open the door of the old brush pen shop and looked at the entrance of the alley. He saw fresh flower petals flying all over the sky, and the music was gentle. A divine sedan was slowly coming under the solemn guard of honor. The great divine priest of revelation had arrived. Damn it, it only took me an hour to finish this chapter. I still like to write this kind of rural literature. Does it start from Yingxiu? I'll try to finish the third chapter before midnight. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 4:15. Hundreds of Yulin royal guards and divine hall guards of Tang guarded around the sacred chariot. They looked solemn and looked around vigilantly among the petals. There were no remnants of the devil's doctrine in Chang'an, nor were there any fanatics. Wherever the great divine priest of revelation went, it attracted countless people to watch. There were pious women and elders kneeling by the road, and the people standing also bowed respectfully, not daring to look at the old man behind the veil on the sacred sedan. The sacred chariot entered the Lin 47th Street and stopped in front of the old brush pen shop. People in the crowded street were talking about it and envied the owner of the shop. They sighed with emotion about the arrival of the great divine priest of Revelation, but they did not know that another great divine priest of West Hill had worked in the shop for a long time last year. The Yulin Royal Guards set up a cordon at the entrance of the alley and invited the crowd outside. The Divine Hall guards occupied several key places at the entrance of the old brush pen shop. The veil was lifted and the great divine priest of Revelation slowly walked down from the sacred chariot. Ning Ke and Sang Sang stood at the entrance of the old brush pen shop to welcome him respectfully. Only the great divine priest of Revelation and Qing Lixue walked into the old brush pen shop. Ning Ke respectfully invited the great divine priest to sit down and wanted to ask Sang Sang to make tea. But he suddenly remembered that Qing Lixue had said it was disrespectful to West Hill and Taoism, so he did it himself. 4 cups of tea were quietly placed on the table. The steam slowly dispersed. The great divine priest of Revelation looked like a very ordinary old man. The deep wrinkles on his face were like mountains and rivers. Only the gorgeous divine robe he wore showed his noble identity. Ning Ke had met many bigwigs, but it was the first time for him to negotiate with such a noble bigwig like the great divine priest of Revelation. He was a little nervous and did not know what to say. Sang Sang was also a little nervous. Although Ning Ke had explained the inheritance rules of the great divine priest of light last night, she still could not understand why the Divine Hall still wanted to take her back since her teacher had betrayed the West Hill Divine Palace. The great divine priest of Revelation looked at them calmly and suddenly smiled. As his smile bloomed, the mountain-like wrinkles at the corners of his eyes deepened. His slightly sunken eyes suddenly calmed down. They were so quiet that no one knew how deep they were. They were like an old well in a dry mountain made of stones. Facing the gaze of the great divine priest of Revelation, Ning Ke suddenly felt that his clothes had disappeared. He felt naked and instinctively felt that he had been seen through. It wasn't his body that had been seen through, but the concealment he had deliberately placed on his soul had been seen through. Even the direction of his fate had been seen through, leaving him with nowhere to hide. Ning Ke suddenly became alert and said, "Ning Ke of the Academy greets the great divine priest." The great divine priest of Revelation said, "Forget it." Ning Ke sat down on the chair opposite the great divine priest. It was quiet in the old brush pen shop. Ning Ke understood that he was the owner and should speak first. However, he did not know how to do it. The steam from the teacup gradually dissipated, and a green tea leaf floated up from the bottom of the teacup. Ning Ke's throat was a little dry. He said in a slightly tight voice, "Can we think about it again?" Qing Lixue, who was standing behind the great divine priest of Revelation, frowned and said unhappily, "Think about it again? Mr. 13, can you stop procrastinating?" The great divine priest of Revelation raised his right hand and stopped Qing Lixue from continuing. He said, "I have something to do in West Hill, so I have to go back. Before I go back, there must be a result." Ning Ke did not pay attention to the great divine priest's words at all. He was thinking about something else. He laughed dryly and said, "The great divine priest of Revelation is leaving? Did you buy any local specialties?" Qing Lixue's expression was very ugly. The great divine priest of Revelation laughed and shook his head. The smile on his old face gradually faded, and the deep wrinkles gradually smoothed out. The great divine priest of Revelation looked at Ning Ke's eyes quietly and said, "You know how important she is to the Divine Hall." Sang Sang looked down at the tip of her shoes outside her skirt and quietly moved 2 steps behind Ning Ke, as if hoping that he could cover himself. However, he could not. The great divine priest of Revelation looked at Sang Sang lovingly and said, "Because she is the successor of light." Ning Ke hesitated and said, "Sang Sang is still very young. It doesn't sound right for her to be the great divine priest of West Hill and be on an equal footing with you." Qing Lixue glanced at the great divine priest of Revelation and explained softly, the succession of the great divine priest is a long process. After returning to West Hill, younger sister Sang Sang must first study the scriptures and then go to the secular world to cultivate in seclusion. She must experience the joys and sorrows of the human world before she can inherit the great divine priest's position. The preparatory work before this is called political training. Then he continued to explain, it will take a long time for younger sister Sang Sang to ascend to the great divine priest of light, so the divine hall is anxious. It is best to enter the political training period as soon as possible. Ning Ke suddenly asked, is there a holiday? Qing Lixue was slightly startled. He thought that the divine hall was not an ordinary school. How could there be such an arrangement? However, before he could speak, the great divine priest of revelation smiled and said, yes. Ning Ke looked at the great divine priest of revelation and continued to ask, how long? The great divine priest of revelation said, as long as she can spend more than half of her time in the Peach Mountain of West Hill. Ning Ke asked again, can she go out of West Hill during the holiday? Yes. Can I go to West Hill to see her? Yes. If she becomes the great divine priest of light, can she really get married? The great divine priest of revelation looked at him with a faint smile and said, yes. Qing Lixue looked at the great divine priest in surprise. The question and answer between Ning Ke and the great divine priest of revelation came to an abrupt end. He said, then I have no questions. The atmosphere in the old brush pen shop had just relaxed a little when Ning Ke unexpectedly added, but it doesn't mean that she has no questions. Next, you need to convince her. Qing Lixue was furious and scolded in a low voice, how dare you be so rude to the great divine priest? Ning Ke said, I am not flirting with the divine hall. If the great divine priest said no to any of the conditions, then I would not allow Sang Sang to go to West Hill. Now I allow her to go to West Hill, but it doesn't mean that I support her going there. It only means that I support any decision she makes. The great divine priest of revelation did not pay attention to the conversation between Ning Ke and Qing Lixue at all. He just looked at Sang Sang quietly. Sang Sang lowered her head and said softly, I don't want to go now. The great divine priest of revelation looked at Ning Ke quietly. Ning Ke said, last night, I discussed with her for a long time. After all, she is only 15 years old and still a child. I really don't feel comfortable letting her leave me. How about going when she is an adult? The great divine priest of revelation smiled and said, next year? Ning Ke shook his head and said, 3 years later. The great divine priest of revelation said, according to the law of the Tang Empire, a girl can become an adult at 16. The law of the Tang Empire says that a girl can get married at 16, but it doesn't mean she is an adult. Ning Ke said, in my opinion, only when she is 18 will she have enough life experience and wisdom to arrange her life. So I insist on going to West Hill after 3 years. 3 years. The great divine priest of revelation sighed softly and looked at Sang Sang behind Ning Quebec. With this glance, the wrinkles on his face deepened, as if a storm had fallen from the sky, washing the dry yellow mountains and rivers even more precipitous. His eyes also became deeper and calmer, and the old well hidden in the depths of the stone mountain became several feet deeper. Sang Sang nervously waited for the answer. Ning Ke was even more nervous than her. The great divine priest of revelation looked at Sang Sang with a smile and said, 3 years later, see you in West Hill. After saying this very suddenly, the great divine priest of revelation stood up and walked out of the old brush pen shop. The great divine priest boarded the divine chariot and left under the lingering ritual music. The master and the servant in the old brush pen shop were left looking at each other. So simple. Ning Ke did not understand why the great divine priest of revelation said the last sentence with such certainty. 3 years later, see you in West Hill. Was the great divine priest sure that Sang Sang would go to West Hill in 3 years? Qing Lixue followed the great divine priest and left the old brush pen shop. He boarded the divine chariot and lifted the veil. He walked to the back of the great divine priest and knelt down. He whispered, "I don't understand. Do I really go back to West Hill like this?" Junior sister Sang Sang didn't even make a promise. Verbal promises never have any power. The great divine priest of revelation took out a white silk handkerchief from his sleeve and gently wiped the corners of his eyes. As the snow-like handkerchief fell, the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes bloomed like flowers. Qing Lishue lowered his head and said confusedly, "But since we are here, why do we have to leave in such a hurry?" The great divine priest of revelation looked at the snow-white silk handkerchief in his hand and said after a moment of silence, "Because the thing that is about to happen in the judicial department is more serious than I thought." Qing Lishue raised his head and said confusedly, "But you said a few days ago that the event in the judicial department is not necessarily a bad thing for the divine hall. The revelation God is just following the order of heaven. Stopping it in advance is equivalent to going against heaven." The great divine priest of revelation said, "Returning to West Hill is not to stop it, but to ensure that after it happens, it can develop according to the existing track." Qing Lishue's eyes fell on the silk handkerchief in the great divine priest's hand. His body suddenly stiffened because he saw a few bloodstains on the snow-white silk handkerchief. Only then did he realize that the corner of the great divine priest's eyes were bleeding. "I saw the light on the Peach Mountain 3 years later. So 3 years later, she will return to West Hill." The great divine priest of revelation continued to wipe the blood from the corner of his eyes calmly. Qing Lishue was a little confused and asked blankly, "What else did you see?" "You idiot. The light is our closest companion. I only took a look at her and I almost went blind. How could I see anything else?" The great divine priest of revelation said with a smile. Then he folded the white silk handkerchief in his hand and continued to wipe the blood from his eyes. The white silk handkerchief was gradually dyed red by the blood that flowed from his eyes. The deep wrinkles at the corner of his eyes were also dyed red by the blood, like a gorgeous peach blossom. It was more like a barren land soaked in blood. Before the West Hill Diplomatic Corps left Chang'an, Ning Ke went to the Southern Gate Temple and learned from Qing Lishue that the judicial department was indeed behind the attack on the Sword Garret. He became more and more worried about Chao Xiaoshu's safety. When he was thinking about leaving Chang'an to look for him in the South Jin Kingdom, he suddenly received a letter from the Great River Kingdom. He had thought that it was from Shanshan, and he felt an indescribable sense of joy. Then he found that it was from Chao Xiaoshu. He was disappointed and then happy, and then angry. He's alive and well. Why didn't he write a few letters in advance? I think he's really happy outside. He's so happy that he even forgot his own father. What an idiot. A middle-aged man in a bright yellow robe angrily waved his sleeves and scolded. I guess second brother Chao met a pretty widow who grinds tofu in a small mountain village. His legs turned to jelly and he couldn't bear to come back. Only an idiot would do something like that. Ning Ke looked at the letter in his hand and sarcastically said. In the secluded hall deep in the Tang Imperial Palace, the curses of idiots could be heard from time to time. The Empress and the others looked at the angry expressions of the Emperor and Ning Ke and could not help but laugh. People really need to put pressure on themselves. Today's writing was really smooth. Tomorrow there will be 3 more chapters. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 4:16. Speaking of idiots, there were 2 people in Chang'an who liked to call others idiots. One was the Emperor of Tang, and the other was Ning Quebec. It was just that His Majesty had always scolded people as idiots regardless of the occasion and situation. Ning Ke, on the other hand, was used to calling others idiots in a mean tone when chatting with Sang Sang. He was petty from the inside out. That was why he was so excited to scold Chao Xiaoshu as an idiot with His Majesty in the Imperial Palace today. His spittle flew everywhere. The word idiot flew like rain in the quiet palace, causing the empress and all the eunuchs and serving girls to be surprised and amused. They covered their mouths tightly to stop themselves from laughing. However, the scene was, after all, a bit awkward. The empress signaled the female official beside her with her eyes and led the serving girls and eunuchs out of the palace quietly. After a long time, the emperor and the minister in the palace finally vented their anger towards Cao Shaoshu. They stopped panting, and the sound of the word idiot gradually faded away. The emperor picked up a square handkerchief from beside the couch and wiped the sweat on his face. He looked at Ning Ke with satisfaction in his eyes. As a wise emperor, sometimes he was bound by the words, wise emperor, and could not be happy. Today he could find someone to curse with him, which made him feel very comforted and happy. What's wrong with your little handmaiden? The great divine priest of revelation didn't tell me about it before he left Chang'an. How did you discuss it? The emperor tapped on the table and motioned for Ning Ke to drink tea. Ning Ke picked up the teacup but didn't drink it immediately. He answered, we'll talk about it in 3 years. If Sang Sang wants to go to West Hill, she can go. The emperor asked, tell me about your little handmaiden. How did she suddenly become the young lady of Xingjing's mansion? How did she suddenly become the great divine priest of light? Ning Ke took a sip of tea to moisten his throat. He carefully told the emperor about how he picked up Sang Sang from a pile of corpses by the roadside and what happened to her in the following years. The emperor was silent for a while and said with emotion, such a strange life experience is hard to describe. The relationship between you and her is rare in the world. You should cherish it. Ning Ke nodded. The emperor looked at him and asked, why didn't she follow you into the palace to see me today? Ning Ke said, she went to the princess's mansion to play. Her Highness has always been on good terms with her. Moreover, the little prince missed her after not seeing her for a few days. As the emperor listened to his explanation, his brows furrowed slightly in worry. Ning Ke understood where His Majesty's worries came from. After a moment of silence, he said, Your Majesty, although these things are the affairs of the world, they are ultimately family affairs. After a moment of silence, the emperor asked, what did the headmaster say? Ning Ke shook his head. The emperor sighed and said, that's true. With master's temperament, how could he care about such troublesome matters? The hall was silent. After an unknown amount of time, the emperor looked into Ning Ke's eyes and suddenly asked, I want to know, what exactly is the enmity between you and General Xiao? Without thinking, Ning Ke shook his head and said, there was no hatred before I went to the wilderness. In other words, it will appear after we go to the wasteland. The emperor looked at him and said, that's why you killed a military counselor in Tiang City. Ning Ke knew that His Majesty was referring to the death of Gu Shi. After thinking for a moment, he said, I don't know what Your Majesty is referring to. Killing a military counselor without permission is a capital crime according to the law of the Tang Empire. The emperor stroked his beard and laughed. He said mockingly, even in front of me, you are not willing to show any evidence. You are probably the only cautious guy in the academy these years. Ning Ke replied with a bitter smile, some things can't be answered. The emperor said, then give me a reason. Ning Ke said, in the wilderness, General Xiao's subordinates disguised as horse gang wanted to kill me, and the general himself was waiting to kill me in the north of Hulan Sea. These two things had long been known to the imperial court through 2 channels, the secret guards and the imperial center administration. However, the imperial court did not take any measures against Xiao except for a reprimand. The emperor put the silk handkerchief on the table and said, you should be very clear that Mr. First dealt with it like that. It was my idea. You should also understand what I mean. I don't have any resentment. I'm just confused as to why those bigwigs in the imperial military refuse to let me go. I don't understand where the military's hostility towards me comes from. Ning Ke said, first of all, General Xiao wanted to kill me in the wilderness. I can understand that he was blinded by the temptation of the Ming hand scroll of the tomes of arcane. But what about General Su Shi? As an important minister of the empire, he tried to kill my little handmaiden, and now he seems to be very dissatisfied with me. I used to be a soldier of the Tang Empire, so I don't understand why he is so vigilant against me." His words were very clear. Whether it was out of consideration for the Empress's mood, the stability of the empire, or the Westhill divine palaces spying on them, as long as Xiahou was willing to retire and the academy had agreed, the emperor would definitely not punish General Xiahou severely. Ning Ke expressed that he could accept this decision, but he wanted to let the emperor know that he could not accept the pressure from the Tang Empire's military. He wanted an explanation. After a moment of silence, the emperor said, "General Su Shi has never been defeated on the battlefield, but he can never raise his head in front of youngest uncle. It's natural for him to be hostile to the academy. As for why he is so vigilant against you, I really don't know. Maybe you should ask him himself." Ning Ke thought that even though he was now a student of the second floor of the academy, it was still a behavior that was asking for a beating to confront the top military man of the Tang Empire. The emperor did not let him stay in this mood for too long. He stood up from the side of the bed and raised his sword-like eyebrows. He looked at him and said in a clear voice, "Have you brought that thing?" Ning Ke raised his hand to touch the hard object in his arms and said, "Yes." "That's good. I'll take you to a place." The emperor flicked his sleeves and walked out of the hall. It was the end of spring, the most enchanting time in Chang'an. Walking in the imperial palace, one could see blooming spring flowers everywhere, green leaves gradually flourishing, quiet lakes without ripples, and pavilions occasionally standing alone. The emperor did not bring any attendants or bodyguards with him. He only brought Ning Ke out of the palace and walked to the depths of the imperial garden. Along the way, the eunuchs and palace maids they met all retreated to the side of the road in awe and silence. Then, they looked at the two figures that were getting further and further away with surprised and puzzled expressions on their faces. The people in the imperial palace were the smartest people. Of course, they knew that the young man in black beside the emperor was the legendary Master Ning Quebec. But they did not understand where His Majesty was taking Ning Ke to and why he did not leave any servants with him. There was a two-story wooden building in the depths of the imperial garden. It was painted in red and looked very exquisite. But compared to the towering palace in the distance, it still looked a little shabby. The emperor brought Ning Ke to the small wooden building and said, "This is it." Outside the small building, the green trees were dense and the wildflowers were in full bloom. It was obvious that they had not been trimmed for a long time. Ning Ke looked at the grass growing between the stone bricks under his feet and thought that perhaps very few people would come here. Then, he raised his head and looked around. His eyes met the walls of the imperial palace and confirmed that this small wooden building was not only in the center of the imperial garden, but also in the center of the entire imperial palace. The emperor pushed open the door of the small wooden building and walked in. Ning Ke followed him in. After entering the small wooden building, His Majesty did not go up the stairs but walked downstairs. A dark passage extended to the depths of the wooden building. Ning Ke looked at the dark passage and could not help but raise his eyebrows. He thought that it was indeed the most important place of the Tang Empire. There was nothing new at all. There were things like luminous pearls in the hard stone walls of the passage, emitting a faint light. It did not make people feel afraid, but made people feel at ease. Ning Ke followed His Majesty downstairs. Looking at the luminous pearls beside him, he thought that any one of them could probably buy the building of pines and cranes. Thinking of the shabby two-story wooden building above, he increasingly felt that the person who built this place was a man who was inwardly coquettish. As he was thinking about these trivial things, his pupils suddenly shrank and he looked up at the stone wall alertly. He saw several deep lines in front of several luminous pearls. Those lines contained an extremely neutral, peaceful, yet indifferent and extremely strong aura. It seemed that as long as it was emitted, it could crush everything in the passage into powder. Ning Ke clearly sensed this aura and gasped in shock. As a talisman cultivator, of course, he could understand that these lines were all Fu characters. These Fu characters were very powerful, but they seemed to be incomplete. Now these lines on the stone wall were just fragments of the original Fu lines. He looked at the lines on the stone wall and calculated the time of their existence. He was shocked and thought silently, what state did the predecessor who carved these Fu lines 1,000 years ago reach? He could actually maintain the power of Fu for such a long time. Could a divine talisman master like his master do it? The emperor noticed his expression and looked up at the stone wall above. After a moment of silence, he sighed with emotion. When my father took me here for the first time, I was as shocked as you. I could only vaguely feel the power of these Fu characters, but I did not want to come here often. What are the conditions to activate these Fu characters? Ning Ke was indeed the successor of Master Yen Sei. He raised the most critical question. Even if the person who carved the Fu characters 1,000 years ago was a divine talisman master, how could the divine talisman he made still maintain its power after his death? It should be known that not every nation master of Tang was a talisman master. Today, Li Qingshan was not one. The emperor said, there are no conditions. Anyone who enters the passage will be killed by these Fu characters. Ning Ke asked confusedly, anyone? The emperor nodded and calmly repeated, anyone. Ning Ke could not help laughing and said, Your Majesty and I are not people? The emperor also laughed. After a moment, his smile gradually disappeared and he calmly said, I am the Emperor of Tang. I hold the national seal and have the imperial aura. So these Fu characters can't hurt me. Ning Ke asked, what about me? The emperor said, you are now the owner of these Fu characters. Today's state is not as good as yesterday's, but I have gradually recovered. I will try to finish the second chapter before 11:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 4:17. Hearing the emperor's words, Ning Ke's expression became a little complicated. He subconsciously raised his hand and touched the slightly hard thing in his arms through the black academy uniform. The dark passage under the small building was not long. It didn't take long for them to reach the deepest part, which was an empty underground hall. Ning Ke had enough mental preparation for what he would see today, but he didn't expect that there was nothing in this hall. The ground in the hall spread around until it disappeared in the darkness. It seemed to be boundless, and there was nothing but dust. There were no countless treasures, armors, magic weapons, iron men or strange beasts, or traces of tactical arrays as he had imagined. The ground was so clean and empty that it made his heart palpitate. There was no gap on the ground paved with granite, and no one knew what craftsmanship the craftsman had used to build the palace. Ning Ke looked up at the starry night pearls on the top of the hall and the man-made stone walls, recalling the wisdom and action of the predecessors of the Tang Empire. He couldn't help but feel dazzled. The emperor led Ning Ke to walk on the clean stone ground into the hall. Their footsteps occasionally brought up a few wisps of thousand-year-old dust. The emperor stopped when they came to the center of the wide stone ground. Ning Ke noticed that there was a small hole in the center of the ground. The edge of the black hole was smooth and perfectly blended with the ground, and it was only as deep as an ordinary person's palm. The emperor said, you know what to do. Ning Ke looked at the small hole on the ground and suddenly asked, is this the array eye? The emperor said, no, the one in your arms is the array eye. Ning Ke was shocked and speechless. He had always thought that the array eye should be an eye, and the thing in his arms was only the key to open it. Now he knew that the array eye had been with him all the time, and he couldn't help feeling a little scared. After a moment of silence, he took out an object from his arms, put it at his feet, and slowly untied the cloth on it. The cloth was coarse cloth used by Sang Sang to cover the soles of her shoes, and it was very strong. Sang Sang had wrapped it in many layers, so it took Ning Ke a long time to untie the cloth. A pestle-like object was lying quietly on the coarse cloth. The material of this pestle was a little strange. It seemed to be metal or stone, faintly exuding a cold smell, but its surface was as warm as jade, and it was engraved with complicated patterns. For decades, this club-shaped object had been kept by Master Yen Sei. Before the battle with the great divine priest of light, Master Yen Sei gave it to Sang Sang and asked her to pass it to Ning Quebec. So now it was in his hands. The emperor silently looked at the pestle-shaped thing on the ground. No one knew if he thought of Master Yen Sei, but his face showed a faint sadness and nostalgia. Ning Ke reached out to hold the pestle and felt the cool and warm touch in his palm. He was a little nervous and put his left hand on it. He took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down so that his hands were no longer trembling. Then he put the pestle upright and slowly inserted it into the hole. The pestle in his hand sank into the ground inch by inch. Ning Ke did not feel any resistance, but he could feel the smoothness of the ground. With a light click, the pestle touched the bottom of the cave, as if it was locked by some kind of spring. A small part of the pestle was still exposed on the ground. The complicated patterns engraved on it made it look like a flower carved out of the pestle. Ning Ke did not know what was going to happen next. He subconsciously stepped back and wanted to stay away from it. There was no vigilance on the emperor's face. He just quietly looked at the half of the pestle on the ground. Ning Ke stopped and stood beside the emperor. After a moment, the half of the pestle exposed on the ground suddenly lit up. More precisely, it should be the complicated patterns on the pestle that were difficult to understand lit up, like a flower bathing in the sun. The complicated patterns became brighter and brighter. The light spread to the lower part of the pestle. Even the granite ground was illuminated and the lines in the stone could be seen. The light in the lines on the pestle gradually condensed and seemed to become a kind of luminous liquid. It gradually flowed back and forth along the lines, which was very beautiful. A crack suddenly appeared on the granite ground next to the pestle. The crack spread extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, it passed through the soles of Ning Ke's feet, which scared him. Then he noticed that these cracks were not real cracks, but grooves formed by the regular subsidence of the ground. Numerous stone grooves appeared on the previously clean and empty ground. More and more stone grooves appeared, and they became denser and denser. Like an invisible carving knife, it drew countless straight lines on the smooth stone ground and cut the ground into countless parts. The liquid light on the pestle flowed down the complicated lines and into the stone groove next to it. Then, like a stream, it flowed along the stone groove and into the distance. However, there was absolutely no stream in the world that could flow as fast as the liquid light in the stone groove. In a flash, it had spread to the edge of the ground. No one knew how much light was contained in the pestle. It kept flowing to the ground, as if it was inexhaustible. After a moment, all the stone grooves were lit up. Looking at the magical scene in front of him, Ning Ke revealed a nervous and solemn expression. But his eyes became brighter and brighter. His gaze kept moving along with the flow of the liquid light in the stone groove. The stone groove at the edge of the ground was the deepest and contained the most liquid light. For extremely long straight lines surrounded the ground in the center of the hall, like a city. There was a deep, wide, and dazzling stone groove in the middle. It seemed to be a long street. This is the Vermilion Bird Avenue? Ning Ke looked at the stone groove and muttered to himself. His Majesty looked at his expression and smiled slightly. Suddenly, the calm liquid light in the stone groove violently rolled, as if there was a raging fire under the ground and the liquid light was about to boil. Ning Ke's expression became more and more solemn. A very faint sound rang in the underground hall, as if countless flowers were blooming, as if countless green trees were breathing, as if countless people were cheering. In reality, it was just the liquid light in the stone groove that had evaporated into gas. The evaporated gas filled the air in the hall, gently swaying like clouds. Then, unable to escape the gravitational pull of the stone groove, it slowly converged into lines or surfaces that glowed with light. These lines and surfaces that glowed with beautiful and pure light formed countless three-dimensional structures on the ground. They were countless glowing buildings that looked so illusory, yet so real at the same time. Ning Ke looked at the palace formed by light in front of him. He looked at the Yanming Mountain in the distance, which was almost at the waist height. He looked at the Wanyan Pagoda that was not even knee-high and looked at the thick and glossy city wall in the distance. He was so shocked that he could not speak for a long time. This was a miniature Chang'an city. But in this Chang'an city, it was real and alive. The emperor walked outside. Ning Ke followed behind him. When his feet stepped on the southern gate temple that was condensed from light, his body was a little stiff. When he stepped on the houses in the west of the city, he was even more careful. He always felt that he had become a giant, and any random step would cause great harm. Fortunately, the lines and surfaces that were condensed from light and vapor did not seem to be connected to the real world. When they touched his body, there were no changes. Walking in the miniature Chang'an city that was condensed by light, Ning Ke felt very complicated and shocked. He saw many familiar buildings and sceneries. He even found Lin 47th Street and the old brush pen shop among the densely packed buildings. At this moment, the old brush pen shop was just a box. Following behind His Majesty, they finally walked out of this miniature Chang'an city. For some reason, Ning Ke felt much more relaxed. He held his chest and gasped. The emperor looked at the Chang'an city in front of him and said, "The entire Chang'an city is a big array." Ning Ke had heard about this from Master Yen say, the first big array in the world, the God-stunning array. The emperor pointed at the pestle on the ground in the distance and the palace beside it. He said, "The center of this big array is deep in the building where we are standing now." Then he pointed at the widest, deepest and brightest stone trough and said, "The Vermilion Bird Avenue is the array route. The four walls of Chang'an city are also array routes. The hole in the city is the door of life. There are countless divine talismans in this formation, and the Vermilion Bird is the most powerful one among them. When Wei Guangming hid in Chang'an, he avoided it. If he had dared to show his full power in the city, this formation would have killed him in an instant." Ning Ke listened attentively in silence. The emperor pointed at the Lake of Light at the foot of Yanming Mountain in the south of the city and said, "This big array in Chang'an city is not easy to build or maintain. Last year, the imperial court spent a lot of money to repair Yanming Lake. It has nothing to do with the people's lives. It is to maintain and repair this big array. These things have always been the responsibility of the imperial center administration. The God-stunning array has a history of 1,000 years. But it has not been activated even once. However, every emperor of the Tang Empire has spared no effort to keep this big array intact. Do you know why?" The emperor looked at Ning Ke and asked. Ning Ke said, "Because this is the last shelter of the Tang Empire." "Shelter, that's a good word." The emperor said calmly, "With this big array, Chang'an city will be safe. Chang'an city will be safe. Even if the national power of the Tang Empire declines and falls apart, it will eventually rise again." Ning Ke said, "My master once told me that when the time comes to activate the God-stunning array, it means that the Tang Empire is in the most dangerous moment. So this big array has never been activated." The emperor said, "But as long as it continues to exist in the world, whether it is activated or not, Chang'an and the Tang Empire are safe." After Ning Ke successfully climbed the mountain and entered the second floor of the academy, he was invited to the palace. At that time, the emperor said that he would take him to see something in the future. Today, he finally saw it. Master Yen Sei once took him to the tower and looked down at Chang'an city. He said that he would hand over the big array to him. Now that his master had passed away, it was finally his turn to take this responsibility. He looked at the Chang'an city in front of him and thought about it. There is one more chapter. I don't know when I can write it. I advise you not to stay up late. I will. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. calm to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 418. Master Yen Sei once said that Chang and was a big tactical array and also a big talisman, and the talisman was an article. Ning Ke looked at the city in front of him, and his eyes fell on the relatively red ball of light somewhere in the south of the straight stone trough. He silently thought that it was probably the seal printed next to the article. The relatively red ball of light was the vermilion bird. As Ning Ke's eyes fell on it, the edge of the ball of light slightly changed, as if it had sensed something. At this moment, Ning Ke vaguely understood how to start the big tactical array of Chang'an. It was so simple, so he was very vigilant. After leaving the shabby two-story wooden building, Ning Ke followed the emperor through the imperial garden again, passing through the awe and confusion of those eunuchs and palace maids, and came to the imperial study. It was quiet in the imperial study. Ning Ke held the array pestle wrapped in cloth, and felt a heavy feeling between his fingers. After a long silence, he said, "I'm a little worried that I can't hold it." The emperor looked at him and said, "Master Yen Sei only has one disciple, and the headmaster of academy has agreed that you represent the academy to enter the human realm. So who else can hold it if not you?" Ning Ke said, "Am I really going to be the nation master in the future?" Second brother and master agreed that I would only cultivate talismans with master, and not be counted as a member of the Southern Gate Temple. Who said that the nation master of Tang must be a Taoist from the Southern Gate Temple? Yes, in order to save some face for the West Hill Divine Palace, it has been handled this way for hundreds of years. But habit doesn't mean rigid rules. Moreover, you are the disciple of Master Yen Sei, and the West Hill Divine Palace can't find any problems with your identity. The emperor said, "From your tone, it seems that you don't want to be the nation master?" Ning Ke said, "When the West Hill Divine Palace wanted to take Sang Sang back to be the great divine priest of light, I thought it was unreliable. Now that I want to be the nation master of Tang, I think it's even more unreliable." He said bitterly, "Now that I think about it, I'd rather stay in the old brush pen shop to sell calligraphy." Qing Shan is very happy to be the nation master. Look at him, he doesn't want to die so soon. Whether you want to be the nation master or not is a matter for the future. You don't need to worry about it now. The emperor changed the topic and said, "Speaking of selling calligraphy, Ning Ke, it's been a few days since your calligraphy has been sold. Come on, take advantage of today's visit to the palace to write a few more." Ning Ke glanced at His Majesty and thought about how he was forced to leave behind many calligraphy sections every time he entered the palace. If Sang Sang knew about this, she would be heartbroken. However, the Tang Emperor personally chose the brush, ground the ink, and waited on the side. In the face of such treatment, no calligrapher in the world would be able to refuse to write. He sighed helplessly in his heart and walked to the table. At this moment, someone knocked on the door of the imperial study. The empress slowly walked in with a plate of food in her hands. Ning Ke bowed slightly and stepped aside. "Eat something first." The empress smiled and took the emperor's hand to the tea table. She handed a bowl of sour tea to him and then walked to Ning Ke's side. She rolled up her sleeves and picked up an ink stick, saying, "Let me grind the ink." Ning Ke thought to himself that he was not a bold and unrestrained person like Li Tai-bai. Although the empress was plump, she was not a romantic person like Yang Yuhuan. What was this? He refused repeatedly and dared not. The empress smiled warmly and jokingly said to him, "You dare when His Majesty grinds the ink for you, but you say you don't dare when I grind the ink for you. Could it be that in your eyes, I am much more terrifying than His Majesty?" The emperor, who was drinking the sour tea, laughed and pointed at Ning Quebec. He said, "She is the one grinding the ink for me when I write. Today, I will let you enjoy this treatment." What kind of treatment was this? An emperor's treatment? Ning Ke smiled bitterly and did not refuse anymore. He stood by the table and waited calmly. Thinking of what the empress had said, he felt a little strange in his heart. In his opinion, the Empress was much more terrifying than His Majesty. In the world shrouded by Haotian's divine light, the Saintess of Diabolism could actually become the Empress of the Tang Empire, the strongest country in the world. No matter how he looked at it, it was strange and terrifying. Moreover, the Empress was Xiao's sister. Ning Ke looked at the Empress's silhouette in silence. The Emperor wanted to appreciate Ning Ke's new work, so he stayed in the imperial study. The Empress and Ning Ke left the imperial study and came to the imperial garden. The Empress stopped under a begonia tree and waved her hand to signal the palace maids to disperse. Then she looked back at Ning Quebec. Ning Ke knew that His Majesty was looking for an excuse to let him and the Empress be alone. Of course, it was not because of any absurd reason. It was because of the general in Tiang City. However, he did not understand why the Empress would come in person. Was she not worried that someone would see something? This was because he did not understand the relationship between the Emperor and the Empress. Or rather, he had never believed that the relationship between a commoner and a couple existed in the Emperor's palace. The Empress was beautiful, charming, gentle, and not timid. Standing under the begonia tree, her appearance was even more beautiful than the begonia flowers. Ning Ke thought that she was indeed the Saintess of Diabolism. She was indeed beautiful. The Empress looked at him quietly and suddenly said, "Has His Majesty told you?" After a moment of silence, Ning Ke replied, "What does Your Majesty mean?" The Empress said calmly, "About General Xiao." Ning Ke nodded. The Empress said, "Now you should know who I am." Ning Ke shook his head, looking a little confused. The Empress smiled sweetly and said, "What a naughty child. I really don't understand why the headmaster of academy would accept you as a student." Ning Ke smiled and said, "Many people have the same question." The smile on the Empress's face gradually faded. She looked at him calmly and proudly and said without any other emotions, "Xiao is my brother. I used to be the Saintess of Diabolism." In Tiang City, Ning Ke had already known the biggest secret of the Tang Empire through the conversation between second brother and Xiao. However, he did not expect that the Empress would admit it directly without any disguise. That was why he was still extremely shocked. The Empress looked at him and said, "I am very curious about the problem between you and Xiao. Although he is violent and enjoys killing on the battlefield, he is definitely not an idiot like you and His Majesty like to call him. He should be very clear that killing a student of the headmaster of academy will not do him any good." After a moment of silence, Ning Ke said, 2 years ago at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road in Min Mountain, General Xiao's subordinates tried to kill Princess Liu. I was there at that time." The Empress gently plucked the begonia branch in front of her face and walked to the depths of the imperial garden with her hands behind her back. Ning Ke followed behind her and looked at her with her hands behind her back. For some reason, he felt some admiration for her. Walking to the side of the quiet lake and standing in front of the flowering tree, the Empress said after a moment of silence, "He did this behind my back. I even suspect that the Divine Hall did it in his name." She turned around and looked at Ning Ke quietly. She said, "Now that you are also a cultivator, you should know that if it was me or General Xiao who attacked with all their strength, you and Liu would definitely not have a chance to survive." Ning Ke thought of the two powerhouses at the upper see-through state beside Xiao and tacitly agreed. He said, "If this matter was done by the Divine Hall, Your Majesty will not be able to find any evidence, because those people are General Xiao's men after all." The Empress smiled slightly and said, "I may not be able to convince Liu, but I think at least now you will have a different judgment on what happened at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road." Ning Ke said, "In the wilderness, Lin Ling wanted to kill me." He knew that the Empress in front of him must know who Lin Ling was and must also know about the horse gang attack. He did not need to explain too much. The Empress said, "I still do not think that the horse gang incident has anything to do with Xiao." Ning Ke said, "I agree with Your Majesty. I also think that Lin Ling did this behind General Xiao's back. But General Xiao expressed his tacit approval afterward and tried to kill me again at the north of Hulan Sea. The empress said, Lin Ling would not do anything that would harm Xiaoho's interests. So he would not try to kill you unless he knew that only one of you could survive. Ning Ke shook his head after a moment of silence and said, I was just an ordinary soldier in the city of Wei in the past. I have never even seen General Xiaoho's face. Apart from these two things, it is impossible for there to be any hatred. The empress looked at his eyes quietly and asked, There really is no hatred? Ning Ke said, Indeed. The empress suddenly bowed slightly to him. Ning Ke was inexplicably shocked. He hurriedly moved aside and said, Your Majesty, what are you doing? The previous matter has been settled by Mr. First. If there is really no hatred that cannot be solved, Mr. 13, please give me some face and let him retire peacefully. How about that? The empress restrained herself in front of the flower tree and maintained a half-squatting posture. Walking on the crowded Vermilion Bird Avenue, Ning Ke looked calm, but his heart was in turmoil. Whether it was the god-stunning array that His Majesty took him to see or the empress bowing in front of the flower tree, it was a pressure that he could not bear now. Previously in the imperial garden, the empress also mentioned Mistress Jian. Ning Ke then remembered the rumors in Chang'an. The empress and Aunt Jian were really as close as sisters. These things did not affect his mood. What really affected his mood was something else. Now the war in the northern wilderness had entered a stalemate. The Tang military did not seem to care about victory. There seemed to be some problems within the West Hill Divine Palace. They seemed to have the intention to temporarily stop the war and wait to see what would happen. This meant that Xiaoho would come back in autumn. Ning Ke had long known that Xiaoho came from the Desolate Man's tribe. At this time, he naturally understood why the northeast border military of the empire was so gentle in this war. Xiaoho might not be so gentle to other enemies. Now Ning Ke was not afraid of Xiaoho because he had the backing of the academy. But he did not know what to do when Xiaoho came back. His Majesty secretly instructed him in the palace, and Her Majesty personally pleaded in front of the flowering tree. It was not because they were afraid that a cultivator in the see-through realm could cause a big storm. They just did not want this matter to involve the academy, and did not want Xiaoho's retirement to have more twists and turns. The academy respected the law of the Tang Empire. The headmaster of the academy strictly forbade students from interfering in court affairs. Eldest brother had already allowed Xiaoho to retire. It seemed that Ning Ke's revenge had all been written until the end, except for the last method. Tomorrow there will be 3 more chapters. Brace up your courage and say it with a trembling voice, and then recommend the first place on the weekly list. Thank you. It's a new day. Please continue to vote for me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.